Hey Dead Signal FM viewers, getting ready for bed? Wishing you a calm and cozy night. Before we start, where are you watching from and what time is it? Let's get started. Whispers at Alabaster Point. The ocean never stopped speaking to Thomas Cahill, not even after 30 years away from Alabaster Point. In his dreams, the Atlantic's cold, gray voice still called to him, whispering secrets that left him gasping awake in his Boston apartment, sheets damp with sweat despite the cranked air conditioning. Sometimes, he thought he could smell salt water in the bathroom sink or hear waves breaking against his kitchen window when rain tapped against the glass. So when his mother's hospice nurse called to say Gloria Cahill was transitioning and wouldn't last the week, Tom felt the familiar dread rise like high tide. He'd have to go back to the lighthouse, back to the point, back to whatever waited for him there. "She's asking for you, Mr. Cahill," the nurse had said, her voice clinical but not unkind. "She keeps saying she needs to tell you something before she goes." Of course she did. Gloria had always been dramatic. Still, she was dying, and Tom wasn't so heartless that he could ignore a dying woman's last request. Even if that woman was his mother. Even if returning to Alabaster Point meant facing everything he'd spent his entire adult life running from. He packed light, just a small duffel with clothes for a few days, and pointed his Subaru north on I-95, leaving a message for his boss at the architectural firm that he'd be out for the week due to a family emergency. It wasn't until he crossed the New Hampshire border that the knot in his stomach truly tightened. By the time the welcome to Maine sign flashed past, his hands were trembling on the steering wheel. "Your fault, Tom. All your fault." The thought came unbidden as it always did. He cranked the radio louder, but it didn't help. Nothing ever did. Alabaster Point hadn't changed much since 1994. The same weathered clapboard buildings lined Main Street, most of them painted the same faded gray-blue as the ocean they faced. Carson's General Store still had the wooden Indian out front, though his nose had finally broken off after decades of teenagers hanging from it on dares. The Lobster Trap Diner still advertised the best clam chowder in New England, though Tom knew from childhood experience that the claim was laughable at best and potentially criminal at worst. He drove through town slowly, noticing how the storefronts had thinned out. A few more boarded-up buildings than he remembered. A few more for-sale signs. A few more locals giving his out-of-state plates the side-eye as he passed. Alabaster Point had never been welcoming to outsiders, and Tom had been gone long enough to become one. Only when the road began to climb did Tom feel truly sick. The lighthouse keeper's house, his childhood home, sat atop the jagged cliff that gave Alabaster Point its name. The white stone formation jutted into the Atlantic like a bony finger, and perched at its very tip was the century-old lighthouse, Alabaster Light. The house beside it, where his mother still lived, was a sprawling Victorian monstrosity that had once been painted cheerful yellow but had faded to the color of ancient teeth. As he rounded the final bend and the structures came into view, Tom had to pull over. His vision swam. For a moment, he could have sworn he saw a figure standing at the cliff's edge, a small, dark silhouette against the gray afternoon sky. But he blinked, and there was nothing but swaying beach grass. A horn blared behind him. Tom jerked back to reality and pulled his car to the side of the road, allowing a rusty pickup to rumble past. The driver, an old man Tom didn't recognize, scowled at him through the window. "Get it together," Tom muttered to himself, gripping the steering wheel until his knuckles whitened. "It's just a house." But as he approached the final stretch of driveway leading to the keeper's house, Tom knew that was a lie. It had never been just a house, not even before what happened with Joey. And after, the hospice nurse's car was parked in the gravel driveway, alongside an older model Honda that Tom didn't recognize. He pulled in behind them and killed the engine, sitting for a long moment in silence. The ocean crashed against the cliffs below, a sound so familiar it might have been yesterday that he left. The front door opened before Tom could reach it. A woman in light blue scrubs stepped out onto the porch, her expression weary but professional. "Mr. Cahill? I'm Diane, your mother's nurse. Thank you for coming." Tom nodded, not trusting his voice. She looked to be in her 50s, with short graying hair and the no-nonsense demeanor of someone who had watched too many people die to be fazed by much. "How is she?" he finally managed. "In and out," Diane said, leading him into the house. "More out than in at this point, but she's been holding on. I think she was waiting for you." The house smelled exactly as Tom remembered, salt and must and the faint hint of cooking oil that never quite dissipated, no matter how many windows were left open. He followed Diane through the narrow hallway, past the kitchen where his mother had fed him cod liver oil every Sunday for his constitution, past the living room where his father would sit silently reading nautical charts long after he'd been forced into retirement, all the way to what had once been his parents' bedroom at the back of the house. Gloria Cahill lay in a hospital bed that seemed too modern and sterile for the ancient room around it. She had always been a small woman, but now she looked diminished, as if parts of her were already disappearing. Her thin gray hair was spread across the pillow, and her skin had the waxy, translucent quality of someone preparing to leave this world. "I'll give you some time," Diane said softly, backing out of the room. "Push the call button if anything changes." Tom approached the bed slowly. It had been 5 years since he'd seen his mother at his father's funeral. She'd barely acknowledged him then, too lost in her own grief, or perhaps too consumed by her anger at him. He wasn't sure which. "Mom," he said quietly. Her eyelids fluttered. For a moment, Tom thought she wouldn't wake. Then her eyes, still that piercing blue that had terrified him as a child, locked onto his face. "Thomas." Her voice was a dry whisper. "You came." "Of course I came," he said, pulling a chair closer to the bed. "How are you feeling?" A stupid question. She was dying. Gloria's mouth twisted into what might have been a smile or a grimace. "Like I'm about to meet my maker, or something else." A chill ran through Tom at her words. "The nurse said you wanted to tell me something." "Yes." Gloria's bony fingers plucked at the blanket covering her. "I need to warn you." "Warn me about what?" "It's happening again." Tom felt the room tilt slightly. "What's happening again, Mom?" "The whispers. From the light. From the sea." Her eyes darted to the window, though from this angle the lighthouse wasn't visible. "I hear them every night now. Getting louder." Tom sighed. His mother had always been superstitious, a trait that had worsened after Joey's death and his father's subsequent decline into alcoholism. He should have known her final words to him would be more of the same nonsense. "Mom, you're on a lot of medication right now. Don't patronize me, boy." Some of her old fire flashed in those blue eyes. "I know what I hear. The same thing your father heard. The same thing Joey heard before." She trailed off, then coughed weakly. Tom reached for the water glass on the bedside table, but she waved it away. "Listen to me. It wants something. It's always wanted something. And now that I'm going, it'll come for you next. Because you're a Cahill. Because of what happened." "Nothing happened, Mom," Tom said firmly, though his heart hammered in his chest. "Joey fell. It was an accident." "No." Gloria's hand shot out with surprising strength, gripping his wrist. "You know that's not true. You've always known." Tom tried to pull away, but she held fast. "I tried to protect you," she whispered. "Your father and I both did. We let them blame us, let them think we were negligent, that we let 2 8-year-old boys play unsupervised near the cliff. Better that than the truth." "Mom, you need to rest. There's a box," she continued, her words coming faster now, as if she were afraid she'd run out of time. "In the lighthouse, under the 3rd step from the top. Your father hid it there after. Evidence. Proof. You need to destroy it, Thomas. Burn it all. Before anyone else sees. Before it uses it to come back." "Before what comes back?" Tom asked, though he wasn't sure he wanted the answer. Gloria's eyes widened, looking past him to the doorway. "It's here," she whispered. Tom turned, expecting to see the nurse, but the doorway was empty. When he looked back, his mother's eyes had closed again, her breathing shallow but steady. "Mom," he tried, but she didn't respond. Tom sank back in the chair, his mind racing. Same old Gloria, filling his head with ghost stories and paranoia. even as she lay dying. Some things never changed. And yet, he found himself looking toward the window, toward where the lighthouse stood sentinel over the gray Atlantic. Joey had fallen or jumped, as some of the crueler town gossips had suggested, from the gallery near the top, plummeting to the rocks below. Tom had seen it happen, or at least that was what he'd told the police at the time. You know what you really saw? Tom pushed the thought away. He was a grown man now, not a frightened child. There were no monsters in the lighthouse, no voices in the waves, just an old building on a lonely coast, and the guilt he'd carried for 30 years. He stood up, needing suddenly to be out of that room, away from his mother's rasping breath and cryptic warnings. In the hallway, he nearly collided with a man coming the opposite direction. "Sorry," Tom muttered, stepping back. The man was about Tom's age, with salt and pepper hair and the weathered face of someone who spent too much time outdoors. He wore a park ranger's uniform, though the patch on his shoulder wasn't one Tom recognized. "No problem," the man said, studying Tom's face. "You must be Gloria's son. I'm Jack Tanner. I check in on her couple times a week." Tom Cahill. They shook hands. "You're not with the State Park Service?" "Alabaster Marine Preserve," Jack explained. "Private outfit. We maintain the shoreline. Keep an eye on the lighthouse since it was decommissioned." He gestured toward Gloria's room. "How's she doing?" "Not good," Tom said honestly. "The nurse thinks it's a matter of days." Jack nodded solemnly. "Sorry to hear it. Your mom's good people. One of the few locals who actually cooperated with us when we took over management of the point. Even gave us access to your dad's records from his lighthouse keeper days." "That's surprising," Tom said. Gloria had always been fiercely protective of his father's legacy. She never much liked sharing family business with outsiders. Something flickered across Jack's face. "Well, I grew up here too. Moved back about 10 years ago. Maybe she didn't consider me an outsider." The name suddenly clicked. "Jack Tanner? You were a few years ahead of me in school. You used to deliver our mail in the summers." Jack smiled. "That's right. Good memory." Tom didn't tell him that he remembered every detail about Alabaster Point, no matter how hard he tried to forget. Instead, he asked, "You said the lighthouse was decommissioned? When did that happen?" "About 15 years back. Coast Guard automated most of the lights along this stretch. Your dad was the last keeper, as I'm sure you know." Tom nodded. His father had been forced into retirement shortly after Joey's death, though the official reason had been budget cuts. Another casualty of that day. "I should check on your mom," Jack said, gesturing to the bedroom door. "I usually sit with her for a bit on Tuesdays while Diane runs errands in town." "That's nice of you," Tom said, somehow unsettled by the idea of this near stranger keeping vigil at his mother's bedside when he himself had stayed away for years. Jack's smile didn't quite reach his eyes. "Like I said, she's good people." He started to move past Tom, then paused. "How long are you staying?" "Just until." Tom couldn't finish the sentence. "Right?" Jack nodded. "Well, if you need anything, my number's on the fridge. And Tom, stay away from the lighthouse. Structure's not safe anymore." Before Tom could respond, Jack disappeared into Gloria's room, closing the door behind him. That night, after Diane had given Gloria her evening medication and retired to the small guest room down the hall, Tom found himself unable to sleep. He'd taken his old bedroom, which his mother had apparently preserved exactly as he'd left it. High school swimming trophies still on the shelves, faded posters of 90s rock bands still taped to the walls. It was like sleeping in a museum exhibit of his former life. Outside, rain began to patter against the window, soft at first, then building to a steady drumming. Tom stared at the ceiling, listening to the storm and trying not to think about his mother's ravings or the strange warning from Jack Tanner. Stay away from the lighthouse. But why? If it was just a safety concern, why had Jack seemed so intense about it? A particularly loud crack of thunder startled Tom fully awake. He sat up, rubbing his eyes, and that's when he saw it. A light where no light should be. Through his bedroom window, which faced the sea, he could see Alabaster Light. And despite what Jack had said about it being decommissioned, the lantern room at the top was glowing with a faint, pulsing illumination. Tom got out of bed and moved to the window. The light wasn't the bright, steady beam that had once guided ships safely past the treacherous rocks below. This was different, more like the glow of embers, reddish and organic. It seemed to throb with a rhythm that reminded Tom uncomfortably of a heartbeat. It's probably just the marine preserve people, he thought, doing maintenance or something. But at 2 in the morning, in a thunderstorm, almost without conscious decision, Tom found himself pulling on jeans and a sweatshirt. He made his way quietly downstairs and grabbed his rain jacket from where he'd hung it by the door. The old house creaked around him as he stepped outside onto the porch, the wind immediately whipping rain into his face. The lighthouse stood 100 yards away, a black cylinder against the churning sky, save for that strange pulsing glow at its crown. The connecting walkway that had once made it easy to travel between the house and the light had collapsed years ago. His mother had mentioned at his father's funeral. Now the only way to reach it was to walk around, following the cliff's edge. This is crazy, Tom thought as he descended the porch steps into the lashing rain. I'm a 40-year-old man chasing lights in a storm because my dying mother spooked me with her deathbed ramblings. And yet he continued, hunching against the wind as he made his way along the narrow path that curved around toward the lighthouse. The rain plastered his hair to his scalp and found its way inside his jacket collar, running cold fingers down his spine. The lighthouse door was padlocked, a thick chain wound through the handle. A sign warned, "Danger. Unstable structure. No entry." The words barely visible in the dim glow of Tom's phone flashlight. He circled the base, wondering what he'd been expecting to find. There were no signs of recent entry, no park ranger vehicles, nothing to explain the light he'd seen from his window. He looked up, squinting against the rain, but from this angle he couldn't see the lantern room. As he completed his circuit and came back to the front door, Tom noticed something odd. The padlock, while securely fastened through the chain links, wasn't actually locked into the door hasp. Someone had made it look secure while leaving it functional. His heart thudded against his ribs as he unwound the chain, letting it drop quietly to the ground. The door creaked open on rusted hinges, revealing the absolute darkness within. "Turn around," a rational voice in his head urged. "Go back to the house. Call Jack Tanner in the morning and tell him the lighthouse isn't properly secured." But another voice, one that sounded disturbingly like Joey's 8-year-old self, whispered, "Third step from the top. Your father hid it there. Evidence. Proof." Tom stepped inside. The smell hit him first. Mildew and rust and something else. Something organic and wrong that reminded him of the time he'd found a dead seagull trapped in his apartment building's air duct. His phone flashlight carved a meager tunnel through the darkness, revealing the familiar spiral staircase that wound up the lighthouse's interior. Tom began to climb, each step groaning beneath his weight. As a child, he'd raced up and down these stairs 100 times, playing tag with Joey or bringing lunch to his father during his shifts. The lighthouse had been a second home, a place of safety and routine. Until that day in '94. About halfway up, Tom paused, breathing heavily. The strange glow was more visible now, filtering down from above, casting the upper reaches of the staircase in that same pulsing, reddish light. And there was something else, a sound. At first, Tom thought it was just the storm outside, wind howling around the stone structure. But as he listened, he realized it had a pattern, almost like whispers. The hair on Tom's arms stood on end. He told himself it was the damp cold, nothing more. Just the wind finding its way through cracks in the old building, creating acoustic anomalies. He forced himself to continue climbing. As he neared the top, the whispers grew louder, though no more intelligible. It was like standing in a crowded room where everyone was having urgent, hushed conversations just below the threshold of comprehension. Occasionally, Tom thought he caught a word or phrase, "Come back or too late or your fault." But when he strained to listen more carefully, it slipped away. The final stretch of stairs led up to the lantern room. Tom counted under his breath, an old habit from childhood. 3 from the top, he muttered. shining his light on the step in question. Unlike the others, this one was not solid metal but had a small access panel set into its surface. Tom had never noticed it before, but then, he'd had no reason to. He knelt down, working his fingers around the edge of the panel until he found purchase. He came away with a screech of rusted metal. Inside was a space about the size of a shoebox. And inside that space was, indeed, a box. An old cigar box with faded Spanish lettering on the lid. Tom lifted it out with trembling hands. The whispers around him suddenly intensified, as if whatever was speaking recognized what he'd found. Tom stood quickly, shoving the box into his jacket pocket without looking inside. He had the overwhelming sense that he needed to get out, to get back to the house before what? He couldn't say, only that the urge to flee was primal and overwhelming. He hurried down the stairs, no longer concerned about the noise he was making. The whispers followed him, seeming to come from the very walls now, urgent and angry. Twice he nearly lost his footing on the slick metal steps. When he finally burst out of the lighthouse door into the storm, Tom didn't stop running until he reached the house. He slammed the door behind him, leaning against it as he gasped for breath, rainwater pooling around his feet on the entryway floor. Bad night for a walk. Tom jerked upright at the voice. Jack Tanner sat at the kitchen table, a mug of coffee in front of him. He looked unsurprised, as if he'd been waiting for Tom to return. "What are you doing here?" Tom asked, trying to control his breathing. "Diane called. Your mother took a turn about an hour ago. I live closer than the doctor, so—" Jack trailed off, eyes dropping to Tom's pocket, where the edge of the cigar box was visible. "Find what you were looking for." Tom instinctively placed a hand over the box, concealing it. "I don't know what you mean." Jack's expression hardened. "I told you to stay away from the lighthouse. Last I checked, my family still owns that building," Tom said, though he wasn't actually sure if that was true. "Ownership was transferred to the preserve when your father died," Jack said coolly. "But that's not the point. That place isn't safe, and not just because of structural concerns." He stood up, moving closer to Tom. "What did your mother tell you?" "Nothing," Tom said automatically. "She's delirious most of the time." Jack studied him for a long moment, then seemed to come to a decision. "Your mother's asking for you. Room at the top of the stairs. She doesn't have much time left." Without waiting for a response, Jack brushed past Tom and walked out into the storm, pulling his ranger jacket tight around him. Tom stood frozen in the hallway, the cigar box await in his pocket, before finally heading upstairs. He would deal with Jack Tanner and his cryptic warnings later. Right now, his mother needed him. Gloria was indeed fading. Her breathing had taken on the rattling quality that Tom recognized from his father's last hours. The death rattle, they called it. Diane stood by the bed, adjusting and drip. "She's been asking for you," the nurse said quietly. "I've increased her pain medication, but it won't be long now." Tom nodded, taking a seat beside the bed. Gloria's eyes were closed, her skin now carrying a grayish tinge that hadn't been there earlier. He took her hand, surprised by how cold it felt. "Mom? It's Tom. I'm here." Gloria's eyes fluttered open, unfocused at first, then locking onto his face with startling clarity. "Did you find it?" she whispered. Tom glanced at Diane, who tactfully stepped out of the room, closing the door behind her. "Yes," he said, once they were alone. "But I haven't looked inside yet." Gloria's fingers tightened around his. "Burn it. Promise me you'll burn it without looking." "Why? What's inside?" "The truth. About that day. About what really happened to Joey." Gloria's voice strengthened with urgency. "Your father, he found things. Records from previous keepers, dating back to when the lighthouse was first built. This happened before Thomas. Every 30 years. A child. Always a child." "Mom, you're not making sense." "Listen." The force of her whisper made Tom flinch. "The box contains your father's research, his theories, and the recording." Tom felt a chill that had nothing to do with his rain-soaked clothes. "What recording?" "The one you made." The day Joey died. You had that little tape recorder. Remember? The one you got for Christmas? You were recording everything that summer. Tom did remember. A small, handheld cassette recorder that he'd carried everywhere for months, documenting bird calls, waves, conversations, anything that caught his fancy. He'd forgotten about it until now. You recorded what happened on the gallery, Gloria continued. What you saw, what took Joey. Your father found the tape in your room afterward. He listened to it. That's impossible, Tom said, his mouth dry. Joey fell. Or jumped. That's what happened. I saw it. Did you? Or did you see something else? Something your mind couldn't process? We knew no one would believe the truth, Gloria whispered. So we let them blame us. Let them say we were negligent. That we let you boys play up there unsupervised. Better that than having everyone think our son was crazy. Tom shook his head, unwilling to hear more. But Gloria continued, her voice growing weaker with each word. It sleeps for 30 years. Then it wakes, hungry, takes a child, then sleeps again. Her eyes drifted toward the window, toward the lighthouse. 3 days ago was 30 years, Thomas. To the day. That's when the whispers started again. When the light came back. Tom felt the blood drain from his face. July 16th, 1994. The day Joey died. And today was July 19th, 2024. The preserve isn't what you think, Gloria whispered. Tanner isn't what you think. They know. They've always known. They protect it. Feed it. Mom, you need to rest. No time, she gasped. It's chosen again. I've seen them in town. The Mercer boy, 9 years old. They've been bringing him to the lighthouse. Getting him ready. Getting him ready for what? But Gloria's eyes had drifted closed again, her breathing becoming more labored. Tom squeezed her hand, suddenly afraid. Mom? Mom, stay with me. Her eyes opened one last time, focusing on something beyond Tom's shoulder. A look of pure terror crossed her face. It's here, she whispered. Thomas, run. Then her hand went slack in his, her final breath escaping in a long, rattling sigh. Tom sat frozen, staring at his mother's still face. Behind him, the bedroom door creaked open. I'm sorry for your loss, Jack Tanner said quietly. Tom didn't turn around. How long were you listening? Long enough. Jack's voice had changed, losing its friendly small-town quality. She always talked too much, your mother, even back when we were kids. Slowly, Tom turned to face him. Jack stood in the doorway, no longer in his ranger uniform, but wearing what looked like some kind of ceremonial robe, dark and adorned with symbols Tom didn't recognize. What the hell is this? Tom asked. The Alabaster Marine Preserve has many functions, Jack said calmly. Conservation is just the public-facing one. Our primary duty has always been to the light. Tom's hand went instinctively to his pocket, where the cigar box pressed against his side. You're insane. No, Tom. I'm a realist. Someone has to be. Jack took a step into the room. The deal was made in 1844, when they first built Alabaster Light. One child, every 30 years, to keep the ship safe, to keep the town prosperous, to hold back what waits in the deep. This is crazy, Tom said, rising from his chair. You're talking about human sacrifice like it's a tax payment. Your father understood eventually, Jack continued, as if Tom hadn't spoken. After he heard the tape, after he did his research, he knew there was no fighting it, no stopping the cycle. That's why he hid the evidence instead of destroying it. Some part of him knew it would be needed again. My father was a drunk who killed himself because he couldn't live with the guilt of Joey's death, Tom snapped. There was no monster, no sacrifice. Joey fell. End of story. Jack smiled thinly. Then why have you never been back to Alabaster Point in 30 years, Thomas? Why do you still wake up screaming? Why can you still hear the whispers even in Boston? He took another step forward. You know what you saw that day, what took your friend. And now it's waking again, hungry. Tom backed up until he hit the wall. Stay away from me. The Mercer boy was supposed to be the offering, Jack said. Everything was arranged. But then your mother started talking, started warning people in town. And now you're here with that box. He nodded toward Tom's pocket. The cycle requires balance, Thomas. If not the Mercer boy, then... Tom didn't wait to hear the rest. He bolted, shoving past Jack and sprinting down the hallway toward the stairs. Behind him, he heard Jack shout something, followed by the sound of pursuing footsteps. He took the stairs 2 at a time, nearly colliding with Diane at the bottom. "Mr. Cahill?" she asked, alarmed. "What's happening?" "Is your mother?" "Call the police," Tom gasped, pushing past her toward the front door. Outside, the storm had intensified. Lightning cracked across the sky, briefly illuminating the landscape in stark white. In that flash, Tom saw them, dark-robed figures, at least a dozen, standing in a loose circle around the house. And beyond them, at the lighthouse, that pulsing red glow had grown stronger, now visibly emanating from the lantern room. Tom hesitated only a moment before making his decision. He couldn't go backward, couldn't fight his way through Jack and whoever else was in those robes. His only chance was forward, toward the lighthouse itself. He sprinted across the rain-slick grass, heading not for the main path but for the treacherous shortcut along the cliff edge that he and Joey had used as boys. Behind him, he heard shouts, saw flashlight beams cutting through the darkness. The cliff path was even more dangerous than he remembered, especially in the storm. 30 years of erosion had narrowed it to barely a foot in places. The sheer drop to the rocks and churning sea below obscured by darkness but no less deadly. Tom pressed himself against the cliff face, edging sideways, the cigar box clutched tightly against his chest. Just like when we were kids, he thought wildly. Just like that day. The memory hit him with physical force. He and Joey, playing explorer, sneaking out to the lighthouse while his father napped. Joey wanting to see the view from the gallery, the climb up the spiral stairs, the strange light they'd found pulsing at the top, though the actual beacon had been off for maintenance. And the whispers, so many whispers. Tom had brought his tape recorder, of course, had been capturing every moment of their adventure. "What's that?" Joey had asked, pointing to something in the corner of the lantern room. Tom couldn't remember what he'd seen, had blocked it out all these years. But he remembered Joey walking toward it, fascinated. Remembered the sound. Not quite a voice, not quite a growl, that had emanated from whatever waited there. And he remembered Joey turning to him one last time, eyes wide with terror, mouth open in a silent scream, before something pulled him through the gallery door and over the edge. That was the official story, anyway. That Joey had fallen or jumped. That Tom had been too shocked to save him, to even move. But now, with the wind howling around him and the lighthouse looming ahead, Tom wondered what was really on that tape. What his father had heard that drove him to drink and eventually to suicide. What his mother had been protecting him from all these years. He reached the lighthouse and found the door still unlocked from his earlier visit. Inside, the whispers were louder than before, no longer confined to the upper levels but filling the entire structure. They had a hungry, excited quality now, like spectators before a sporting event. Tom began to climb the spiral stairs again, one hand on the railing, the other still clutching the cigar box. The red glow from above grew stronger with each step, pulsing faster, like a heart rate increasing in anticipation. Behind him, the lighthouse door crashed open. "Cahill," Jack's voice echoed up the stairwell. "Stop! You don't know what you're doing." Tom climbed faster, his legs burning with the effort. The lantern room was just ahead, bathed in that unnatural crimson light. The whispers had reached a fevered pitch, and now Tom could make out words, phrases, his own name repeated over and over. "Thomas, Thomas, come back. Your fault. Your turn. Your time." He burst into the lantern room, gasping for breath. The space was as he remembered it, circular, glass-walled, with the massive Fresnel lens at its center. But the lens wasn't illuminated by the usual lamp. Instead, it seemed to be focusing that red light, which emanated not from any mechanical source but from what appeared to be a tear in the air itself, a vertical slit of crimson in the very fabric of reality. And emerging from that tear, reaching into our world with appendages that Tom's mind couldn't properly process. Too many joints, too fluid in their movement, like tentacles but with bones, was something ancient and patient and hungry. "Tom," it said, in a voice that was 1,000 whispers overlaid. At last, Tom backed away until he hit the gallery door. The thing before him seemed to smile, though it had no face that he could discern. Just that sense of terrible anticipation. 30 years, it continued. A long time to wait for what was promised, what was owed. "I owe you nothing," Tom managed to say, though his voice shook. "Not you, the town, the bargain." The thing's appendages undulated in what might have been a shrug. "But now you're here, the one who got away, the one who saw, better than the Mercer boy, much better." "What are you?" Tom whispered. "I am the darkness beneath the waves. I am what keeps the ships safe, the fish plentiful, the town alive. I am Alabaster Point's silent partner. And every 30 years, I collect my due." Heavy footsteps sounded on the stairs behind Tom. He had seconds at most before Jack and the others reached the lantern room. Tom looked down at the cigar box in his hands. His mother had told him to burn it without looking. Jack wanted it for some unknown purpose. Everyone seemed to think it contained some kind of proof, some evidence of what really happened 30 years ago. With shaking hands, Tom opened the box. Inside was a small cassette tape, unlabeled, alongside a stack of yellowed papers covered in his father's cramped handwriting. On top of the papers was an old photograph, a group shot of lighthouse keepers standing in front of Alabaster Light, dated 1964. His father, a much younger version, stood at the end of the row. Beside him was a boy about 8 years old, his face blurred as if he'd moved during the exposure. But what caught Tom's eye was a notation on the back of the photo: July 19th, 1964, day of the offering. The thing in the tear seemed to pulse with excitement as Tom stared at the photo. "You understand now. Your father understood too in the end. The cycle, the necessity. What happened to Joey wasn't necessary," Tom said, his voice stronger now, fueled by a rage 30 years in the making. "It was murder, sacrifice," the thing corrected, "for the greater good. One life every 30 years, to save hundreds from the sea's wrath, to keep the lighthouse burning, to keep me satisfied." The gallery door behind Tom burst open. Jack stood there, breathing hard, flanked by 2 other robed figures. "Thomas," Jack said, his voice eerily calm, "step away from the beacon." "The beacon?" Tom looked back at the thing emerging from the tear. "Is that what you call this monster?" "Not a monster," Jack said. "A guardian, a protector. Alabaster Point has never lost a fishing vessel since the pact was made. Never suffered a hurricane or flood. While other coastal towns wither and die, we endure. At the cost of a child every 30 years, Tom said bitterly. Jack's expression hardened. "A small price for the survival of many. Your father understood that after he heard what was on that tape. He agreed to help us prepare for the next cycle. My father killed himself because of what you people made him do. Your father killed himself because he couldn't live with the knowledge that his own son was meant to be the offering in '94. Not Joey Crawford," Jack said coldly. "The beacon had chosen you, Thomas. But somehow Joey went over the edge instead. The cycle was disrupted." Tom felt as if the floor had dropped away beneath him. "What? Why do you think you've heard the whispers all these years? Why the beacon calls to you even from hundreds of miles away? It's been waiting to complete what was started 30 years ago." Jack took a step forward, hand outstretched. "Give me the box, Thomas. Let me play the tape. Let you hear what really happened that day." The thing from the tear, the beacon, undulated with what seemed like eager anticipation. "Yes," it whispered. "Remember. See. Accept." Tom looked down at the tape in his hand, then at the stack of research his father had compiled. Slowly, he began to understand. His father hadn't hidden the box to preserve evidence. He'd hidden it as bait, knowing that someday, when the cycle began again, Tom would be drawn back to Alabaster Point, back to the lighthouse, back to what waited for him there. "No," Tom said quietly, then with more force, "No." In one fluid motion, he hurled the entire box, tape, papers, photo and all, directly at the pulsing tear in reality. The beacon's appendages scrambled to catch it, but too late. The box disappeared into the crimson glow. For a moment, nothing happened. Then the tear began to widen, the red light intensifying until it was painful to look at. The beacon's form seemed to twist in on itself, its whispers rising to a shriek that threatened to shatter the glass walls around them. "What have you done?" it howled, the sound reverberating through Tom's skull. "Broken the cycle," Tom said, though he had no idea if that was true or even possible. Jack lunged at him, face contorted with rage. "You fool! Do you know what you've unleashed?" The lighthouse began to shake, stones grinding against stones as the ancient structure protested the forces being unleashed within it. The Fresnel lens shattered, sending glass shards flying across the room. Tom ducked, hearing one of Jack's companions cry out as they were struck. "We need to get out of here," Tom shouted over the growing cacophony. But Jack wasn't listening. He stood transfixed, staring at the widening tear as if in communion with whatever lay beyond. "It's not supposed to be like this," he whispered. "The bargain." He never finished the sentence. One of the beacon's appendages shot out, wrapping around Jack's waist and yanking him toward the tear. Jack didn't even scream as he was pulled through, disappearing into that impossible crimson glow. His companions fled, racing down the spiral staircase with cries of terror. Tom should have followed, but something held him in place. A morbid fascination, perhaps, or a sense that his role in this wasn't finished. The tear continued to widen, now taking up nearly half the lantern room. The beacon itself seemed to be retreating, pulling back into whatever dimension it called home. But as it withdrew, the tear became unstable, its edges fluctuating wildly. "Not over." The thing's voice echoed, growing fainter. "Never over. We'll return. We'll hunger. We'll find you." "Not if I end it first," Tom said, though he had no plan, no idea how to accomplish such a thing. Then his eyes fell on the shattered remains of the Fresnel lens. For over a century, it had focused light to guide ships safely past Alabaster Point's treacherous rocks. Now, in its broken state, it was focusing something else, the very energy of the tear itself, refracting it back into the opening. A plan formed in Tom's mind, desperate and probably suicidal, but the only option he could see. He began gathering the largest pieces of the lens, ignoring the cuts to his hands as he positioned them to create a crude reflective array, all aimed at the tear. The effect was immediate. The crimson light, redirected back upon itself, created a feedback loop of energy. The tear began to pulse erratically, its edges burning white-hot. "Stop!" the beacon's voice commanded, suddenly desperate. "You don't understand." But Tom did understand, at least enough to know that whatever this entity was, whatever pact it had made with Alabaster Point's founders, it feared this dissolution of its doorway into our world. The lighthouse shook more violently now, stones cracking, mortar crumbling. Tom knew he had moments at most before the entire structure collapsed. He made one final adjustment to the glass array, then turned and ran for the stairs. Behind him, the lantern room erupted in an explosion of crimson and white light, the sound like 1,000 voices screaming at once. The force of it knocked Tom forward, sending him tumbling down the spiral staircase. He fell for what seemed like forever, pain blossoming in his shoulder, his hip, his head. Then darkness. Tom awoke to the rhythmic beeping of hospital monitors and the sterile smell of antiseptic. His body felt like one massive bruise, and when he tried to move, sharp pains shot through his left arm and leg. "Easy there," a voice said. "You've got a broken arm, 2 cracked ribs, and a concussion. Not to mention about 30 stitches worth of cuts all over you." Tom blinked, his vision gradually focusing on a woman in a sheriff's uniform standing at the foot of his bed. "Where am I?" he croaked, his throat raw. "County Hospital," she said. "Alabaster Point doesn't have the facilities for trauma cases like yours." She moved closer, studying his face. "I'm Sheriff Mallory. Mind telling me what happened out at the lighthouse?" Tom closed his eyes, the events of that night washing over him in confusing fragments. There was a storm. The lighthouse collapsed. My mother. Your mother passed away earlier that evening, according to her nurse, Sheriff Mallory said gently. I'm sorry for your loss. The others, Tom said, struggling to sit up. There were others there. Men in robes. Jack Tanner. We haven't found anyone else, Mallory said, her expression growing serious. Just you, about 20 feet from what's left of the lighthouse foundation. As for Jack Tanner, no one by that name works for any park service or preserve in the county. Are you sure about what you saw? Tom sank back against the pillow. Of course there would be no evidence. Just like 30 years ago, when Joey died, the truth would be buried, dismissed, forgotten. The nurse, Diane, she can confirm some of it, Tom said weakly. Diane Lohman? She says she left to get supplies from town and came back to find your mother deceased and you nowhere to be found. By the time she called emergency services, the storm had knocked out power to half the county. Mallory paused. Mr. Cahill, I have to ask, were you taking any medications? Anything that might have caused hallucinations or confusion? Tom almost laughed. So that was how they'd play it. The grieving son, stressed and possibly medicated, wandering into a dangerous structure during a storm. A tragic accident, nothing more. No, he said finally. No medications. Mallory nodded, clearly not believing him. Well, when you're feeling up to it, I'll need a formal statement. For now, get some rest. After she left, Tom stared at the ceiling, trying to make sense of what had happened. Had he really seen what he thought he saw? Or had 30 years of guilt and his mother's superstitious ravings created a delusion his mind accepted as truth? He closed his eyes, exhaustion overtaking him. Just before sleep claimed him, he heard it. Faint but unmistakable. A whisper. Not over, Thomas. Never over. We'll return. We'll hunger. We'll find you. 3 months later, Tom Cahill stood at the edge of the cliff where Alabaster Light had once stood sentinel over the sea. The lighthouse was gone now, nothing but a circular concrete foundation marking where it had been. His mother's house had been sold, her few possessions either donated or packed away in a storage unit Tom wasn't sure he'd ever open. He'd told the sheriff what she wanted to hear, that stress and grief had led him to the lighthouse during the storm, that he'd been inside when lightning struck, the official explanation for the collapse, that his memories of anything else were likely concussion-induced hallucinations. They'd found no trace of Jack Tanner or the robed figures. No record of any Alabaster Marine Preserve. The cigar box and its contents were gone, presumably destroyed in the collapse. Tom had nothing to prove his story, not even to himself. And yet, the whispers had stopped. For the first time in 30 years, Tom slept through the night without nightmares of Joey's fall, without the sound of the ocean calling his name. Whatever had happened that night, whether supernatural occurrence or psychological break, something had been resolved. He knelt down, placing a small bunch of wildflowers on the cliff edge where Joey had died, where something had taken him, according to his mother, where the cycle had been disrupted. I'm sorry, Joey, Tom said quietly, for not saving you, for not understanding sooner. The wind carried his words out to sea, and for a moment, Tom thought he felt a presence beside him, small, child-sized, peaceful. Then it was gone, and he was alone on the cliff, watching the waves crash against the rocks below. As Tom turned to leave Alabaster Point for what he knew would be the last time, he didn't notice the small, dark-haired boy watching him from the beach below. Didn't see how the boy's eyes reflected the setting sun with an unnatural, crimson glow. Didn't hear the whispers that surrounded the child like a swarm of invisible insects. Not over, the boy said in a voice that was not his own, a smile spreading across his face. Never over. 30 years. The cycle continues. The boy turned toward the sea, raising a small hand in greeting to something only he could see beneath the waves. Something patient, something hungry, something that could wait another 30 years if necessary. After all, time meant little to the darkness beneath Alabaster Point. It had made its bargain long ago, and bargains, like cycles, never truly end. They just change form. The quiet town. The first thing Pete Thorne noticed about Millhaven was the silence. He'd pulled off Route 9 just after sunset, the October dusk already dissolving into full darkness. His Honda's headlights swept across the town's welcome sign, Millhaven, POP 1402, and immediately the hush enveloped his car like a physical presence. In his rearview mirror, the highway traffic continued its distant hum, but here, barely a quarter-mile from the main road, the quiet was thick enough to taste. Pete's knuckles whitened on the steering wheel. The radio, which had been playing classic rock from a Portland station, now emitted only static. He switched it off. "Guess we've arrived," he murmured to himself, the words sounding unnaturally loud in the car's interior. As he drove down Main Street, he noted the standard small-town landmarks. A diner with flickering neon, a gas station, a hardware store with a faded awning, all closed for the night. The street lamps cast yellow pools on empty sidewalks. Not a soul in sight. Pete had chosen Millhaven because of its obscurity. 3 months after Sarah's death, the sympathy from friends and colleagues had curdled into something else. Concern, perhaps, or worse, pity. He'd overheard whispered conversations. Poor Pete, still can't get it together. Maybe he needs professional help. No, what he needed was distance. Space to breathe without feeling Sarah's absence pressing against his ribs. He'd taken a sabbatical from the university, packed what he could fit in his car, and rented a cabin on the outskirts of this nowhere town in western Maine. Now, as he turned onto Spruce Road, Pete felt the first stirrings of doubt. He'd expected small-town quaintness, not this unsettling emptiness. He checked his watch. 7:42 p.m. Too early for a place to be this deserted. The cabin appeared up ahead, a dark silhouette against darker trees. Pete's headlights illuminated a small porch and weathered clapboard siding. Nothing like the rustic charm promised by the online listing, but it would serve his purpose. He parked, grabbed his duffel bag, and climbed the 3 steps to the front door. The key turned with a reluctant grind. Inside, the air was stale and cold, carrying a faint smell of damp wood and something else. Something sweeter, almost medicinal. Pete fumbled for a light switch, found it, and blinked as a naked bulb revealed the cabin's interior. A small living room with a worn sofa, a kitchenette with dated appliances, a narrow hallway leading to what must be the bedroom and bathroom. "Home sweet home," he said, his voice flat. He was unpacking when he heard it. A soft, repetitive sound, like something being dragged across the ground outside. Pete froze, tilting his head to listen. Scritch, scritch, scritch. It stopped. Pete continued unpacking, but more slowly now, his ears straining. When the sound resumed, louder this time, he moved to the window and peered into the darkness. Nothing but the silhouettes of pine trees and the gleam of moonlight on his car's hood. Yet the sound continued, a rhythmic scratching that seemed to move around the perimeter of the cabin. Scritch, scritch, scritch. Pete told himself it was probably a branch brushing against the siding. Or an animal, a raccoon, maybe. But the sound's regularity made him uneasy. He moved away from the window and busied himself with setting up his laptop, checking his phone, no service, and heating a can of soup he'd brought for dinner. By the time he crawled into bed, the scratching had stopped. Pete lay awake for a long time, staring at the ceiling, his mind cycling through memories of Sarah, her laugh, the way she'd twist her hair around her finger when reading, the last morning he'd seen her alive before the accident. The doctor had called it an aneurysm. Nothing anyone could have done, he'd said, his face professionally somber. It was instantaneous, but Pete couldn't shake the feeling that if he'd been there instead of at his office, he might have noticed something. A wince, a comment about a headache, some warning sign that could have saved her. He was drifting toward sleep when he heard it again. Scritch, scritch, scritch. This time, it sounded like it was coming from directly beneath the floorboards. Pete sat up, his heart pounding. The cabin was silent again. He told himself it was just the building settling, old wood contracting in the cold night air. But as he lay back down, the scratching resumed, more insistent now, as if something were trying to claw its way up from below. He thought about getting up to investigate, but exhaustion won out. His last thought before sleep claimed him was a strange one, that the sound didn't seem like it was trying to get in. It sounded like it was trying to get out. Pete woke to sunlight streaming through threadbare curtains. For a moment, he didn't remember where he was. Then the events of the previous day flooded back, and he felt the familiar hollow sensation in his chest that had been his constant companion since Sarah's death. He showered in tepid water, dressed, and headed out to explore the town and pick up some groceries. In daylight, Millhaven looked less ominous but no less strange. The streets were still eerily quiet, though he did see a few people. An elderly man sweeping the sidewalk in front of the hardware store, a middle-aged woman hurrying into the post office, a teenager on a bicycle who stared at Pete's car as he drove past. Pete pulled into the parking lot of Larson's Market, a single-story building with faded green trim. A bell jingled as he entered, and the cashier, a heavy-set man with thinning gray hair, looked up from his newspaper. "Morning," Pete said, offering a smile. The man nodded without returning the smile. "Help you find anything?" "Just picking up some basics. I'm renting the Keller cabin, out on Spruce Road." At the mention of the cabin, the cashier's expression changed, a flicker of something. Concern? Alarm? Passing across his face before settling back into neutrality. "That's so? Staying long?" "A few months, maybe. I'm on sabbatical from Dartmouth, working on a book." The man grunted and returned to his newspaper. Pete wandered the aisles, filling his basket with essentials. Bread, eggs, coffee, canned goods. At the register, he attempted small talk again. "Pretty quiet town you've got here." "We like it quiet," the cashier replied, scanning items with mechanical efficiency. "That'll be $42.60. As Pete paid, he noticed a local newspaper on the counter. The headline caught his eye. "Anniversary of Tragedy Approaches." Below, it was a grainy photo of what looked like a crowd gathered in front of a building. "Mind if I take this?" Pete asked, reaching for the paper. The cashier's hand shot out with surprising speed, covering the newspaper. "That's my copy. Ones for sale are by the door." Pete retracted his hand. "Sorry." Outside, he checked the newspaper rack but found it empty. He loaded his groceries into the car, that strange hollow feeling in his chest expanding. Back at the cabin, Pete spent the afternoon setting up his workspace and beginning his research. His book, A History of New England Folk Beliefs and Superstitions, had been Sarah's idea originally. They'd planned to work on it together, combining his academic background with her talent for narrative. Now it felt like a tenuous connection to her, a project he had to complete because she couldn't. As evening approached, Pete decided to walk the property. The cabin sat on about an acre of land, mostly wooded, with a small clearing in the back. The October air was crisp, carrying the scent of pine and decay. Fallen leaves crunched beneath his feet. At the edge of the clearing, something caught his eye, a stone structure partially covered by undergrowth. He approached it cautiously. It was a well, its circular stone wall standing about 3 feet high, capped with a wooden lid secured by a rusty padlock. Pete brushed away leaves and dirt to reveal an inscription carved into one of the stones. 1887. He tried to lift the lid, but the padlock held firm. He made a mental note to ask the property manager about it. As he turned to head back to the cabin, he noticed something else. A path, barely visible, winding from the well into the woods. Curiosity piqued, Pete followed it. The trees grew denser, the path narrower, until he came to a small clearing. And there, nestled among the trees, was a cemetery. It wasn't large, perhaps 24 graves in total, but it was old, the headstones weathered and leaning. Some so eroded their inscriptions were illegible. Pete moved among them, reading the names and dates he could make out. Eliza Keller, 1855 to 1892. Thomas Keller, 1847 to 1894. Infant daughter, 1891. The Keller family, presumably the original owners of his cabin. Pete felt a prickle of unease at the discovery of this forgotten graveyard so close to where he'd be living. The largest monument was a granite obelisk in the center of the cemetery. Unlike the other stones, this one looked relatively recent. Pete circled it, reading the inscription. In memory of those lost in the Millhaven tragedy. October 31st, 1987. Below were engraved 27 names. Pete stared at the monument, the hollow feeling in his chest expanding into something like dread. What had happened here? A fire? Some kind of accident? He was so absorbed that he didn't hear the footsteps until they were right behind him. You shouldn't be here. Pete whirled around to find a young woman. Early 30s, perhaps, standing just a few feet away. She was slim, with dark hair pulled back in a practical ponytail, her face pale in the fading light. "I'm sorry," Pete said, recovering from his surprise. "I didn't realize this was private property." "It's not. It's just..." She hesitated, her eyes flicking to the obelisk and back to him. "People don't come here much anymore. I'm renting the cabin down the path," Pete explained. "Pete Thorne." "Rachel Curtis," she replied, not offering her hand. "The Keller place, huh? How long have you been there?" "Just moved in yesterday." Rachel nodded, her expression unreadable. "Any particular reason you chose Millhaven?" The question seemed oddly pointed, and Pete found himself answering more honestly than he'd intended. "I needed somewhere quiet after my wife died. Somewhere no one knew me." Rachel's face softened. "I'm sorry for your loss." The words were standard, but her tone carried a weight of genuine understanding. "What happened here?" Pete asked, gesturing to the obelisk. "In 1987? Rachel's eyes clouded. "It's not something we talk about much in town. There was an incident. A lot of people died." "What kind of incident?" She shook her head. "It's getting dark. You should head back to the cabin before you lose your way." As if on cue, the forest seemed to darken around them, the shadows deepening between the trees. "What about you?" Pete asked. "I know these woods," Rachel replied. Then, with a slight edge to her voice, "But if I were you, I'd lock my doors tonight. It's almost the anniversary." Before Pete could ask what she meant, Rachel turned and walked away, her form quickly swallowed by the gathering darkness. Pete made his way back to the cabin, unease slithering along his spine. Inside, he double-checked the locks on the doors and windows, feeling slightly foolish but unable to shake Rachel's warning. That night, the scratching returned, louder and more insistent than before. It seemed to move around the cabin, first at the front door, then along the sidewall, then under the floorboards. Pete got out of bed and followed the sound, pressing his ear against walls and floor, but it always seemed to be coming from just beyond his reach. Around midnight, it stopped. The silence that followed was somehow worse, a waiting, pregnant silence that hummed with anticipation. Pete returned to bed but couldn't sleep. In the darkness, his thoughts turned to Sarah, as they always did in these quiet hours. He remembered how she'd loved horror stories, especially King's. She'd tease him about his academic skepticism toward the supernatural. "There are more things in heaven and earth, Professor Thorne," she'd quote, her eyes twinkling. Pete closed his eyes, trying to conjure her face, but the image that came to him was distorted, wrong. Sarah's features contorted, her mouth open in a silent scream. His eyes snapped open. In the corner of the room, a shadow seemed to move, to deepen. Pete stared at it, heart hammering. Then it was gone or had never been there at all. Sleep, when it finally came, was thin and troubled, populated by dreams of Sarah walking through unfamiliar woods, calling his name, her voice growing fainter as he tried to follow. The next morning, Pete drove into town and found the local library, a small brick building with Millhaven Public Library EST 1923, engraved above its doors. Inside, an elderly librarian sat at the circulation desk, her white hair pulled into a severe bun. "Can I help you?" she asked, peering at him over wire-rimmed glasses. "I hope so," Pete said. "I'm researching local history. Specifically, I'm interested in what happened here in 1987. The woman's expression didn't change, but her hands, which had been sorting index cards, went still. "Our local history section is in the back," she said after a pause. "You can help yourself." Pete thanked her and made his way to the indicated shelves. There were several books on Maine history, a few on Millhaven's founding and early years, but nothing that mentioned 1987 or any tragedy. He returned to the circulation desk. I can't seem to find anything about the events of 1987. Do you have newspaper archives from that period? The librarian's mouth tightened. Those archives are restricted. Restricted? Why? Town council decision. Her tone made it clear she wouldn't elaborate. Pete tried a different approach. I'm a history professor at Dartmouth. I'm writing a book on New England folk beliefs and local legends. Anything you could share would be invaluable. Something in the woman's expression shifted. A professor? What's your name? Pete Thorne. She studied him for a long moment, then seemed to come to a decision. Wait here. She disappeared into a back room and returned with a manila folder. These are copies of some newspaper articles from that time. You can read them here, but they don't leave the building. Pete took the folder to a reading table and opened it. Inside were photocopies of articles from the Millhaven Gazette and larger newspapers like the Portland Press Herald. The first headline caught his breath. Mass poisoning claims 27 in small Maine town. The article, dated November 1st, 1987, described how 27 residents of Millhaven had died after drinking water from a local well that had somehow been contaminated with cyanide. The deaths had occurred within hours of each other on Halloween night. Subsequent articles detailed the investigation. No culprit was ever identified, though theories ranged from accidental contamination to mass suicide to deliberate poisoning. The well had been on the Keller property, the very property where Pete was now staying. One article included photos of the victims. Pete scanned them with growing horror. Children, elderly people, adults in the prime of life. And then a name caught his eye. Curtis Michael, 34. Curtis, Rachel's last name. Given her age, it could have been her father. The final article in the folder, dated a year after the tragedy, described the memorial service and the town's decision to seal the well permanently. A quote from the mayor at the time: "Millhaven will heal, but we will never forget. Some wounds cut too deep." Pete closed the folder, his mind spinning. 27 people, dead from poisoned well water on his property. And now, almost exactly 38 years later, he was living there, hearing strange scratching sounds at night. He returned the folder to the librarian. "Thank you. This was informative." She nodded, her eyes solemn. "You said you're staying in town?" "Yes, at the old Keller place." The librarian's face paled. "The Keller place? Do you know what happened there?" "I just read about it," Pete said. She leaned forward, lowering her voice. What the papers didn't report was that the Kellers were always different. There were stories about them going back generations. Dark stories. What kind of stories? The librarian glanced around, though the library was empty. "They say Eliza Keller practiced folk magic. Healing mostly, but other things too. And when her daughter died of fever in 1891, she couldn't accept it. They say she tried to bring the child back, using the well water in some kind of ritual. Instead, something else came back." She shook her head. "Just old tales, of course." Pete thought of the well, padlocked and abandoned, and the cemetery with its weathered gravestones. And the 1987 tragedy? Was that connected to these stories? Some think so. Others say it was just a terrible accident. She straightened. "But you should be careful out there, especially with the anniversary coming up. Halloween night. What happens on the anniversary?" The librarian fixed him with a stare. "Nothing if you're sensible. Lock your doors and don't drink the water from the well." She paused. "And if you hear scratching in the night, don't answer it." Pete felt a chill run down his spine. "How did you know about the scratching?" But the librarian had already turned away, signaling the end of their conversation. That evening, Pete sat on the cabin's porch, watching the sun set behind the trees. The information he'd gathered weighed heavily on his mind. He couldn't help but connect the tragedy of 1987 with the strange sounds he'd been hearing, and with Rachel's warning. As darkness fell, he noticed a figure emerging from the woods. Rachel herself, walking purposefully toward the cabin. Pete stood as she approached. "I thought I might find you here," she said, her voice carrying in the still air. "I've been at the library," Pete replied, "reading about what happened in 1987. Rachel nodded, her expression grim. "I figured. Mrs. Henley called me." She climbed the steps to the porch. "May I?" Pete gestured to the second chair and she sat. For a moment, they were silent, watching the last light fade from the sky. "Michael Curtis," Pete said finally. "He was one of the victims. Your father." "Yes." Rachel's voice was quiet but steady. "I was 5 years old. My mother and I had gone to visit her sister in Portland that weekend. We came back to find half the town dead or dying." "I'm sorry," Pete said inadequately. Rachel shrugged, a small, tight movement. "It was a long time ago, but you stayed in Millhaven. Where else would I go? This is home." She turned to face him. "But you have no ties here. You should leave." Pete frowned. "Because of what happened almost 4 decades ago? Because it's not over," Rachel said, her voice sharp. "It's never been over. Every year at Halloween, things happen. People see things, hear things. A few years ago, a family that bought the old Keller place disappeared during the night. Just packed up and left without a word to anyone. And you think I'm in danger?" Rachel looked out at the darkening woods. "I think there's something wrong with that well. Always has been. The water was tested after the poisoning, but they never found any contamination. Yet 27 people died after drinking from it." Pete thought about the scratching sounds, the shadow in his room. "I've been hearing things at night. Scratching sounds." Rachel didn't seem surprised. "It's starting early this year. Usually it's just the day before and the day of Halloween." "What is it?" "I don't know. Nobody does. But my father..." She hesitated. "The night before he died, he told my mother he'd been hearing scratching at their windows. He thought it was branches in the wind." Pete felt a chill that had nothing to do with the evening air. "And you think whatever killed those people in 1987 is still here?" "I think there are things in this world we don't understand," Rachel said, echoing Sarah's sentiments so closely that Pete felt a pang of loss. "And I think you should leave Millhaven before Halloween." Pete was silent for a long moment. The rational part of his mind, the academic, the skeptic, dismissed Rachel's warnings as superstition fueled by tragic loss. But another part of him, a deeper, more primitive part, responded to the fear in her voice. "I can't just leave," he said finally. "My work." "Your work will still be there if you take a few days away," Rachel insisted. "Just until after Halloween." Pete shook his head. "I need to understand what's happening here." Rachel stood abruptly. "Then you're a fool. But at least promise me one thing. Don't go near that well. And whatever you do, don't drink the water." She started down the steps, then paused. "And if the scratching gets worse, if you hear voices calling your name, don't answer them." She disappeared into the darkness before Pete could respond. That night, the scratching was back, more insistent than ever. It moved around the cabin, then focused on the bedroom window. Pete lay rigid in bed, staring at the glass, half expecting to see a face pressed against it. Then, just as the scratching reached a fever pitch, it stopped. In the silence that followed, Pete heard something new. A voice, so faint he might have imagined it. "Pete!" it whispered, a sound like dry leaves rustling. "Pete, help me." The voice was familiar, terribly, impossibly familiar. It was Sarah's voice. The next day, Pete drove to the town hall, determined to find more information about the 1987 tragedy. The clerk, a thin man with a perpetual frown, was unhelpful until Pete mentioned he was staying at the Keller place. "You're at the old Keller cabin?" the man asked, his frown deepening. "Brave of you this time of year." "So I've been told," Pete replied. "I'm trying to understand what happened there in 1987. The clerk hesitated, then reached under the counter and pulled out a key. "Records rooms in the basement. Normally, I'd need to get permission, but, well, you have a right to know, staying out there." The basement was dim and musty, filled with metal filing cabinets and shelves of bound volumes. The clerk led Pete to a cabinet marked 1987 and unlocked it. "Take your time," he said. a note of sympathy in his voice. "Just lock up when you're done." Alone, Pete started digging through the files. Most contained the same information he'd already found at the library, but one folder, labeled Autopsy Reports Restricted, caught his attention. Inside were medical examiner's reports for all 27 victims. Pete scanned them, his stomach turning at the clinical descriptions of symptoms: convulsions, respiratory failure, cyanosis. But there was something odd. While all reports listed the cause of death as apparent cyanide poisoning, none identified the source of the poison. And then Pete found a note, handwritten, attached to the final report. Upon further analysis, no trace of cyanide or any known toxin found in victims' systems. Cause of death remains unknown. Investigation ongoing. The date on the note was December 15, 1987, more than a month after the official story of cyanide poisoning had been released to the public. Pete sat back, his mind racing. If not poisoning, what had killed those people? And why maintain the poisoning story? As he was replacing the files, his hand brushed against something tucked at the back of the drawer. A small, leather-bound book. Pete pulled it out and examined it. The cover was worn, the pages yellowed with age. Inside, handwritten on the flyleaf, was "Property of Eliza Keller, 1889. A journal. Pete's heart quickened as he flipped through the pages. The entries were sporadic, sometimes separated by months, sometimes continuing for pages daily. Eliza wrote about her life on the farm, her husband Thomas, her daughter Mary, and then, in November 1891, the entries changed. Mary had died of fever, and Eliza's grief poured onto the pages in cramped, desperate handwriting. "I cannot bear it. My sweet Mary, my child, taken from me. Thomas says we must accept God's will, but I cannot. I will not. There must be a way to bring her back to me." The entries that followed described Eliza's descent into what could only be described as occult practices. She wrote of consulting with an old woman in the woods who knew the old ways, of gathering herbs and preparing concoctions, of rituals performed at midnight. And then, an entry from December 21, 1891. "It is done. The ritual was completed at midnight. The well water carried my blood, my tears, my plea to whatever powers might hear. I have opened the door for my Mary to return. Now I wait." The next entry, dated 3 days later, was exultant. "Something is coming. I hear it scratching at night, trying to find its way to me. Soon it will break through. Soon I will have my Mary back." Pete's mouth went dry as he read on. The scratching Eliza described, the same sound he'd been hearing at night. But the journal entries grew increasingly disturbed. "It is not Mary. What comes through the well is not my child. I have made a terrible mistake. I have opened a door that should have remained closed." The final entry, dated January 15, 1892, was a frantic scrawl. "It is coming for me now. I have sealed the well as best I can, but it finds ways out. Thomas says he hears nothing, sees nothing, but I know the truth. It whispers to me in Mary's voice, but it is not Mary. Whatever comes through that well wants in, wants out, wants us. I have doomed us all." Eliza had died in February 1892, according to the cemetery records. Her husband followed 2 years later. Pete closed the journal, his hands trembling slightly. The story was fantastic, unbelievable. Yet the scratching sounds he'd heard matched Eliza's descriptions exactly. And now, voices calling his name in the night, in Sarah's voice. He pocketed the journal and left the records room, his mind made up. He needed to see the well again, to understand what was happening. Back at the cabin, Pete grabbed a flashlight and a crowbar from his car's trunk and headed toward the clearing. The well sat as he'd left it, undisturbed, its padlock gleaming dully in the afternoon sun. Pete examined the structure more carefully this time. The stones were worn but solid, the wooden lid weathered but intact. The padlock was newer than the rest, probably the one placed after the 1987 tragedy. Using the crowbar, Pete pried at the lock. It resisted at first, then gave way with a snap. He removed it and set it aside, then grasped the edge of the wooden lid. For a moment he hesitated, Rachel's warning echoed in his mind. Don't go near that well. But the academic in him, the part that needed to understand, pushed him forward. He lifted the lid. The well was deep, its bottom lost in shadow. A dank, sweet smell rose from its depths. The same medicinal odor he'd noticed in the cabin. Pete shone his flashlight down, but the beam seemed to be swallowed by the darkness. What was he hoping to see? Some evidence of poison? Some sign of the supernatural presence Eliza had described? As he leaned closer, the flashlight beam finally caught something. A reflection, perhaps, or movement at the very bottom of the well. Pete squinted, trying to make it out. Then a sound rose from the well. A scratching, scrabbling sound, as if something were climbing the stone walls. And with it came a voice, clearer now than it had been in the night. Pete? Pete, help me. I'm trapped down here. Sarah's voice, unmistakable, calling to him from the depths. Pete jerked back, nearly dropping the flashlight. This was impossible. Sarah was dead, buried in New Hampshire. Whatever was in the well, it wasn't her. He remembered Eliza's words. It whispers to me in Mary's voice, but it is not Mary. With shaking hands, Pete replaced the lid and backed away from the well. The scratching continued, now accompanied by what sounded like sobbing. Sarah's sobs. The way she'd cried at her father's funeral. Pete turned and ran back to the cabin, his heart hammering. Inside, he locked the door and sank onto the sofa, his mind reeling. The journal, the well, the voices, the scratching, the 1987 deaths. It all connected somehow, a tapestry of horror that had been weaving itself for over a century. His phone rang, startling him. It was Rachel. I just had a feeling, she said without preamble. Tell me you didn't go to the well. Pete's silence was answer enough. Damn it, Rachel hissed. What did you do? I opened it, Pete admitted. I heard my wife's voice coming from inside. Rachel was quiet for a long moment. Then, it's starting earlier than I thought. Listen to me, Pete. Whatever you heard, it's not your wife. It's what took my father and those other people in '87. It's what Eliza Keller called up from somewhere else. What is it? Pete asked, his voice barely audible. I don't know. No one does. But it uses our grief, our loss, to reach us. It speaks in the voices of those we've lost. Makes us think they've come back. Rachel's voice cracked. The night before my father died, he told my mother he'd heard my grandfather calling to him from the woods. My grandfather had been dead for 10 years. Pete thought of the voice calling his name, so perfectly Sarah's voice. What do I do? You leave, Rachel said firmly. Right now. Pack your things and go. Don't come back until after Halloween. And if I don't, then you might not leave at all. Pete didn't leave. He couldn't. Not now that he'd heard Sarah's voice. Some part of him, the part still raw with grief and longing, couldn't let go of the possibility, however remote, that Sarah was somehow reaching out to him. The rational part of his mind knew better. Sarah was gone. Whatever was in the well, whatever was scratching at his walls and whispering in the night, it wasn't her. It was something else, something that had been waiting, perhaps, since Eliza Keller's desperate ritual in 1891. That night, the scratching was relentless. It moved around the cabin, under the floorboards, at the windows, at the door. Pete sat in the living room, every light on, Eliza's journal open on his lap, reading and rereading her frantic final entries. It finds ways out, she'd written. It whispers to me in Mary's voice. The parallels were too exact to be coincidence. Whatever Eliza had encountered, whatever had killed those 27 people in 1987, it was now focused on him. Around midnight, the scratching stopped. In the sudden silence, Pete held his breath, waiting. Then came the voice, no longer from the well but from right outside his door. Pete? Pete, I'm cold. Let me in. Sarah's voice, but wrong somehow. Too hollow, too desperate. You're not Sarah, Pete said, his voice trembling. Pete, please. It's me. I need your help. Let me in. Pete pressed his hands over his ears, but the voice continued, seemingly inside his head now. I'm so alone here, Pete. So cold. Why won't you help me? You're not real, Pete whispered. You're not Sarah. The voice changed then, became angry, petulant. But I could be Sarah for you. I could be anyone you want. Just let me in. Pete reached for his phone and dialed Rachel's number. She answered immediately. Pete? What's happening? It's outside my door, he said, his voice shaking. It's using Sarah's voice. It wants me to let it in. Don't, Rachel said urgently. Whatever you do, don't open that door. I'm coming over. No, it's not safe. Stay where you are. I'll be there soon. The line went dead. Pete stared at the front door, behind which the thing with Sarah's voice continued its pleading. Pete, don't you love me anymore? Don't you want me back? The worst part was that he did. Despite everything, despite knowing it wasn't really Sarah, some part of him wanted to open the door, to see her face again, to hold her. The minutes crawled by. Outside, the voice grew more insistent, more desperate. Pete sat rigid on the sofa, hands clenched, fighting the urge to respond. Then came a knock. Not at the front door, but at the back. Pete! It was Rachel's voice, real and solid. It's me. Let me in. Pete hurried to the back door and opened it. Rachel slipped inside, her face pale in the harsh light. She carried a backpack and what looked like an old shotgun. It's still at the front door, Pete whispered. Rachel nodded grimly. I heard it as I came around the house. Sounds like your wife. Yes, it's perfect. Her voice, her inflections. Pete swallowed hard. Part of me wants to. I know. Rachel cut him off. That's how it works. That's how it got my father and the others. She set down her backpack and began unpacking items. Salt, candles, a bundle of dried herbs, a small leather-bound book that looked similar to Eliza's journal. What's all this? Pete asked. Protection, Rachel replied. My grandmother taught me. She was friends with Eliza Keller before everything went wrong. As Rachel worked, arranging candles and drawing lines of salt across doorways and windowsills, she explained, after the 1987 deaths, my mother started researching what had happened. She found Eliza's journal in the town records, just like you did. She became convinced that whatever Eliza had called up through the well was responsible for the deaths. And what did she do about it? Rachel's hands faltered briefly. She tried to fight it. She performed a ritual at the well on Halloween night in 1992, trying to close what Eliza had opened. Didn't work. She disappeared that night. They found her clothes by the well, but never her body. Pete stared at her. And you've stayed in Millhaven all this time, knowing this thing was still here? Someone had to keep watch, Rachel said simply. Someone had to warn people away from the well, especially around Halloween. Outside, the voice that wasn't Sarah's had stopped its pleading. The silence was somehow more ominous. Why Halloween? Pete asked. Thin places, Rachel replied, lighting the last candle. That's what my grandmother called them. Times when the boundary between worlds is weaker. Halloween is the thinnest of all. Pete thought of Eliza's ritual on the winter solstice, another traditional thin place between worlds. So whatever she called up through the well, it can only fully come through on Halloween? It can always come partway, enough to scratch, to whisper, to lure, but on Halloween it can actually cross over. That's what happened in 1987. 27 people answered the call of their dead loved ones. 27 people opened their doors or went to the well. Pete remembered the autopsy reports. No trace of cyanide or any known toxin found. What did it do to them? Rachel's face hardened. It emptied them. That's the only way I can describe it. They were found with their eyes and mouths open, as if they'd seen something so terrible it had shocked them to death. But the medical examiner said it was as if they'd been hollowed out, like something had consumed whatever makes us human. A chill ran down Pete's spine. And you think it's going to try again tomorrow night? Halloween? I know it will. It always does. Rachel finished her preparations and sat across from Pete. But usually it only has power over those who've been here longer, who've heard the scratching for days or weeks. You've only been here a few days, and already it's using your wife's voice. That's not normal. Pete thought of the well, of lifting the lid and hearing Sarah's voice rise from the darkness. I opened the well today. Could that have made things worse? Rachel's eyes widened. You didn't just open it. You broke the lock. Pete nodded. Damn it, Pete. That lock wasn't just to keep people out. It was part of the binding that kept that thing partially contained. She ran a hand through her hair, her expression shifting from anger to fear. We need to reseal it. Now, tonight, before Halloween. How? Rachel hesitated, then seemed to come to a decision. My grandmother left instructions. A ritual similar to what my mother tried, but different. It requires two people. One to perform the binding, one to close the door from this side. The implication hung in the air between them. You're talking about a sacrifice, Pete said slowly. Not death, Rachel clarified. But someone has to give themselves over to the threshold, become the door, essentially. Become the lock. And you were planning to do this alone? Rachel smiled thinly. I've been waiting for someone else to arrive who could help. Someone who could hear the voices, who would understand what we're facing. Someone like me, Pete said. Someone who's lost someone they loved. Rachel corrected. The ritual needs that connection to work. She looked at him steadily. I know it's asking a lot, but if we don't try, more people will die tomorrow night. That thing will grow stronger with each person it takes. Pete thought of Sarah, the real Sarah, not the hollow imitation trying to lure him outside. She would have wanted him to help, to prevent others from experiencing the devastating loss he'd felt when she died. I'll do it, he said. Tell me what we need to do. They waited until 3 a.m., the dead hour Rachel called it, when the barrier between worlds was naturally thinner. The scratching had resumed, moving around the cabin like a restless predator testing for weaknesses. But it stayed outside the lines of salt Rachel had laid. By the beam of flashlights, they made their way to the well. The night was moonless, the darkness thick under the trees. Pete carried Rachel's backpack, filled with the items they would need for the ritual. The well stood as he'd left it, the broken padlock at its base, the wooden lid slightly ajar. As they approached, a soft sound came from within. Not scratching now, but a kind of wet, slithering noise, as if something were moving in liquid. Rachel knelt beside the well and began unpacking the items from the backpack. Candles, a silver knife, a bowl, herbs, salt, and a small wooden box. What's in the box? Pete asked. Rachel opened it to reveal a human tooth, yellowed with age. My father's, she said quietly. A physical connection to someone the entity took. She placed the candles in a circle around the well and lit them. Their flickering light cast long shadows through the trees. Pete felt exposed, vulnerable in the small circle of light. What do I need to do? He asked. Rachel handed him the silver knife. First, a few drops of your blood in the bowl. Blood of the living. Then hold this. She gave him a small, smooth stone. It's from the cemetery earth of the dead. And finally, you'll need something of Sarah's. Pete hesitated. I don't have anything with me. Nothing? A photo? A piece of jewelry? Pete shook his head, then remembered his wedding ring. He still wore it, unable to remove it after Sarah's death. He twisted it off his finger and held it up. Will this work? Rachel nodded. Perfect. A symbol of your bond, created while you were both living. She instructed Pete to stand at the edge of the well, while she positioned herself opposite him. Between them, the open well gaped like a wound in the earth. When I begin the ritual, Rachel explained, it will know what we're trying to do. It will fight back. It will try to distract you, to make you doubt. Whatever you hear, whatever you see, you must keep your focus on the binding words. She handed him a slip of paper with a short phrase written on it in an unfamiliar language. Repeat this 7 times while holding the stone in your left hand and the ring in your right. On the 7th repetition, drop both into the well. And then I do my part, Rachel said, her voice steady but her eyes betraying fear. I become the lock. Before Pete could ask what that meant, Rachel began speaking in a low, rhythmic chant. Not English, not any language Pete recognized. She sprinkled herbs and salt around the well's edge, then pricked her finger with the knife and let 3 drops of blood fall onto the tooth in the wooden box. The air around them seemed to thicken, to press inward. The candle flames stretched tall, then bent toward the well as if drawn by an invisible current. And from the well came a sound, a terrible, rasping moan that raised the hair on Pete's neck. "Now, Pete," Rachel urged, her voice tight with concentration. "Speak the words." Pete looked down at the slip of paper and began reciting the strange syllables, stumbling at first but gaining confidence with each repetition. The stone felt warm in his left hand, the ring cold in his right. "Pete," came Sarah's voice from the well, clear and desperate. "Pete, don't do this. It's really me. I found a way back to you." Pete faltered, his voice catching. "Don't listen," Rachel hissed. "It's not her. Pete, please." The voice continued, breaking with sobs. "I miss you so much. I'm so alone here. I need you." Pete closed his eyes, forcing himself to continue the chant. He was on the 4th repetition when the voice changed. "You couldn't save me," it said, no longer pleading but accusatory. "You weren't there when I needed you, and now you're trying to send me away for good." Tears stung Pete's eyes. He kept chanting, but each word was an effort, as if speaking through mud. 5th repetition. The air grew colder, the candle flames dimming. "If you do this, you'll never see me again," the voice warned. "Is that what you want? To lose me forever?" 6th repetition. The stone in Pete's left hand was burning hot now, the ring in his right ice cold. Rachel's chanting had risen in volume, her face strained with effort. And then, as Pete began the 7th repetition, the voice changed again, became something inhuman, a chorus of voices speaking in unison. "We have waited so long. We are so hungry. Let us in." A wind rose, though there was no wind in the still night air, whipping around the well. The candles guttered and went out. In the sudden darkness, Pete could see something moving within the well, a writhing mass of shadow, reaching upward. "Finish it," Rachel shouted over the wind and the voices. Pete spoke the final words and dropped the stone and ring into the well. There was a sound like glass breaking, then a howl that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere. A sound of rage and hunger and bottomless despair. The darkness in the well surged upward, a pillar of shadow that rose into the night sky. Pete stumbled back, falling to the ground. Rachel stood her ground, arms outstretched, still chanting. As Pete watched in horror, tendrils of darkness reached for Rachel, wrapping around her arms, her neck, her face. She didn't fight them but seemed to draw them in, her voice never faltering. "Rachel!" Pete cried, scrambling to his feet. She turned to him, her eyes reflecting the darkness that was consuming her. "Stay back," she commanded. "This is my part. I'm the lock." The darkness pulled tighter around her, seeping into her skin like ink into paper. Rachel's chanting became labored, each word forced out through gritted teeth. But still she continued, drawing the entity into herself. And then, with a final surge, the darkness vanished. Not dissipating, but condensing, contracting into Rachel's form. She swayed, then straightened, her eyes now solid black from corner to corner. "Rachel!" Pete ventured, taking a step toward her. She held up a hand, stopping him. When she spoke, her voice was layered with others. Some human, some decidedly not Rachel anymore. Not entirely. She gestured to the well. "Close it. Seal it with the new lock." Pete hesitated, then moved to the well and replaced the wooden lid. As he did, he noticed a new padlock had appeared. An ancient-looking thing of black iron, its surface carved with symbols similar to those on the paper Rachel had given him. "Lock it." The thing that had been Rachel commanded. Pete snapped the lock shut. It made a sound like a final breath being exhaled. Rachel, or what remained of her, nodded in satisfaction. "It is done. The door is closed. The lock is set." She looked at Pete with those black eyes. "But not forever. Nothing is forever." "What happens now?" Pete asked. "What happens to you?" I contain it. For now. For years, perhaps. She smiled, and it was still Rachel's smile, though the black eyes made it something foreign, uncanny. But eventually the lock will weaken. Eventually someone else will need to come. Someone else who hears the scratching, who knows loss. I can't just leave you like this, Pete protested. You must. This is my purpose. My family's purpose, since Eliza's mistake. She turned away from him. Go back to your life, Pete Thorne. Grieve for your wife properly. Let her go. And never return to Millhaven. Before Pete could argue further, Rachel walked away, her form seeming to blur at the edges, to merge with the darkness of the woods. In moments, she was gone. Pete stood alone by the sealed well, the night quiet around him. The scratching had stopped. The voices were silent. Whatever had been trying to get through was contained once more, bound within Rachel Curtis, the human lock on an inhuman door. Pete left Millhaven the next morning. He packed his car in the pale dawn light, left the cabin key in the mailbox, and drove away without looking back. As he passed the town limit sign, he felt a weight lift from his shoulders, but another settle around his heart. He'd come to Millhaven seeking escape from his grief. Instead, he'd found something darker, deeper, more ancient than personal loss. And he'd left behind a woman who had sacrificed herself to contain that darkness. In the months that followed, Pete finished his book, though it was very different from what he'd originally planned. He wrote about grief and loss, about the thin places between worlds, about the human need to deny death's finality. He didn't mention Millhaven by name or Rachel or the well. Some stories weren't his to tell. Sometimes, in the darkest hours of night, he thought he heard scratching at his window. But it was only branches in the wind, he told himself. Only the normal sounds of an old house settling. And if sometimes, in dreams, he saw Rachel Curtis with her black eyes, walking alone through endless woods, he tried not to remember upon waking. The scratching, after all, was just scratching. The voices just voices. Until one night in late October, nearly a year after he'd left Millhaven, Pete woke to a sound he'd tried so hard to forget. A soft, persistent scratching at his bedroom door. And then a voice, not Sarah's this time, but equally familiar. Pete. Rachel's voice, strained and distant. Pete, I need your help. It's getting stronger. I can't hold it much longer. Pete lay rigid in his bed, heart hammering, as the scratching continued. He knew he shouldn't answer, knew he shouldn't open the door, but he also knew, with a certainty that transcended logic, that whatever had happened in Millhaven wasn't over. The lock was weakening. The door was opening once more, and this time it knew exactly where to find him. The end. The Hollow. Part 1. The Return. Adam Kelly squinted at the faded green road sign as a bitter October wind shook his rental car. After 15 years away, he was back in Kings Hollow. Main population now 1,216. Down nearly 300 since he'd left. The sign looked the same, though. Same peeling paint, same bullet hole in the upper corner from some drunk's hunting rifle. Some things never changed, even when everything else did. He drummed his fingers on the steering wheel and forced himself to push down on the accelerator. Just 5 days. That's all he needed to get his father's house ready to sell. 5 days in this place that had left more scars on him than the accident. Adam flexed his left hand, feeling the familiar tightness of the burned tissue that wrapped around his wrist like a glove. The doctors had done what they could, but 15 years later, it still pulled when he was tired or stressed. And coming back to Kings Hollow qualified as both. The town materialized slowly from the thick pine forests, unchanged in that peculiar way of dying rural communities. Boarded storefronts along Main Street wore the same faded paint, just more chipped away. The dairy freeze where he'd spent summers scooping ice cream was now shuttered, a for lease sign hanging crookedly in the window. He slowed as he passed Milligan's Hardware, relieved to see it was still open, lights glowing warm against the gathering dusk. His father's house sat at the edge of town, where the paved road gave way to gravel that eventually disappeared into Blackwood Forest. Adam slowed the car as he approached the turn onto Sycamore Lane. The old mailbox was still there, Kelly hand-painted in his mother's neat script, though the paint had nearly vanished with time. As he turned into the driveway, the house came into view. 2 stories of weathered clapboard the color of dirty dishwater, with a sagging front porch and shutters that hung at odd angles. It looked smaller than he remembered. Everything did. Adam parked and sat for a long moment, gathering himself. The key he'd received from his father's lawyer felt unnaturally heavy in his pocket. Robert Kelly had been dead for 3 weeks now, found by a neighbor after he'd failed to show up at the diner for his regular Saturday breakfast. Heart attack, they said. Quick and painless, they said. Adam wondered if that was true or just what they told the estranged son who hadn't spoken to his father since the night of the fire. The house creaked a welcome as he pushed open the front door. The smell hit him immediately. Cigarettes, old coffee, and something underneath. A faintly medicinal odor that reminded him of hospitals. The lawyer had mentioned hospice care in the final months, though his father had refused to tell Adam about his declining health. Adam flipped on lights as he moved through the house. Little had changed. The same faux wood paneling in the living room, the same plaid couch, the same collection of fishing trophies gathering dust on shelves. The only things his father had ever seemed truly proud of. In the kitchen, a calendar still hung on the wall, October's page showing a picturesque New England covered bridge surrounded by fall foliage. His father had X'd out each day until October 3rd, the day he died. 3 neat lines forming each X, with the final stroke missing on that last day. Adam dropped his duffel bag on the kitchen table and noticed an envelope propped against the salt and pepper shakers. His name was written on it in his father's shaky scrawl. Adam, if you're reading this, I suppose I'm gone. Doc Webb says it could be any time now. I know we haven't spoken, but I'm leaving you the house and what little else I have. Do with it what you want. There's something you should know. About that night. About what happened in the hollow. I should have told you years ago. It wasn't your fault. It never was. It's been happening in King's Hollow for generations. Look in the shed. Bottom drawer of the red toolbox. I kept everything I found. Be careful out there. Things have been stirring again. The ground in the hollow is moving. Dad. Adam read the note twice. A chill working its way up his spine that had nothing to do with the drafty house. The hollow. He hadn't let himself think about that place in years. The depression in Blackwood Forest. A place where nothing grew. Where the ground was perpetually spongy underfoot. Where he and his friends had gone that summer night when they were 17, drunk on stolen beer and the invincibility of youth. The night Jenny died. The night of the fire. Outside, the wind picked up, rattling the kitchen window in its frame. Adam folded the note carefully and placed it in his pocket. Tomorrow, he told himself. He'd look in the shed tomorrow. Tonight, he just needed to sleep, to prepare himself for 5 days of sorting through his father's life, boxing up the remnants of their broken relationship. But sleep, when it finally came on his father's lumpy couch, brought only dreams of the hollow, of Jenny's laugh cutting off into a scream, of the ground suddenly giving way beneath them, of fire racing up his arm as he tried to reach her. And underneath it all, a rhythmic sound like a heartbeat coming from deep within the earth. Thump thump, thump thump. Adam woke with his heart racing and sweat soaking his t-shirt, the phantom pain in his scarred hand almost unbearable. Outside, the first light of dawn was breaking through the trees, and in the distance, a crow called out a warning. Welcome home, it seemed to say. Welcome back to King's Hollow. Adam spent the morning sorting through the kitchen cabinets, separating the few items worth keeping from the many destined for donation or trash. His father had never been one for sentiment, but he'd kept the same chipped coffee mug, "World's Greatest Dad" in faded letters, that Adam had given him for Father's Day when he was 8. The work was mechanical enough to keep his hands busy, but his mind kept returning to his father's note. Look in the shed. Bottom drawer of the red toolbox. By noon, he couldn't resist any longer. The shed stood at the back of the property, a small structure of weathered wood that leaned slightly to one side. It had been his father's sanctuary, a place where Robert Kelly would retreat to tinker with fishing lures or simply escape from the quiet house that had grown too loud with absence after Adam's mother died. A padlock secured the door, but the key on Adam's ring slid in smoothly. Inside, Dust motes danced in the shafts of light that penetrated the dirty windows. The shed smelled of motor oil, sawdust, and the peculiar tang of metal tools. The red toolbox sat on the workbench, exactly where it had always been. Adam ran his fingers over its dented surface before pulling it open. The top drawers contained the expected assortment of screwdrivers, wrenches, and other tools, all meticulously organized. The bottom drawer stuck slightly, and Adam had to jerk it hard to slide it open. Inside was a manila folder, its edges worn soft with handling. Written on the tab in his father's neat block letters was a single word: hollow. Adam lifted the folder with trembling hands and opened it on the workbench. Newspaper clippings, some yellowed with age, others more recent. Photographs, handwritten notes on lined paper torn from a spiral notebook. The oldest clipping was dated 1879, its text barely legible. Tragedy at Blackwood Hollow. 3 children missing after ground collapse. Search continues. Another from 1921. Mysterious deaths plague Kings Hollow. 2 loggers found deceased near Blackwood Depression. Causes unknown. Authorities baffled by strange markings. And more every 30-odd years like clockwork. 1957, 1988, and then 2010, the year Adam and his friends had gone to the hollow. The year of the fire. Local teen dead. Another injured in forest accident. Jennifer Patterson, 17, died Friday night when ground collapsed during a bonfire in Blackwood Forest. Adam Kelly, 17, suffered severe burns attempting rescue. Adam closed his eyes against the memory. Jenny's terrified face as the ground beneath the bonfire suddenly gave way, her hand reaching for his, their fingers almost touching before she was gone, swallowed by the earth. The sudden rush of flame as the fire collapsed inward, catching his left arm as he lunged for her. He told everyone it was an accident. The ground simply caved in. But in his nightmares, he remembered something else. The earth pulsing beneath their feet like something breathing, and in the moment before Jenny fell, the distinct feeling that something below had reached up and pulled. Adam forced himself to continue through the folder. His father had compiled personal accounts, interviews with Kings Hollow's oldest residents recounting stories passed down through generations. Tales of the Hollow being a hungry place, of disappearances dating back to the original settlement in the early 1800s, of strange sounds coming from beneath the earth. But it was the photographs that made Adam's blood run cold. Recent ones, dated just weeks before his father's death. The hollow at dawn, mist rising from the ground, and in the center, barely visible through the fog, what looked like a mound rising from the depression that had claimed Jenny's life. A mound that resembled nothing so much as a massive, swollen pustule on the forest floor. On the back of the photo, his father had written, "It's growing again, just like in '88, just like when Marie disappeared." Marie, Adam's mother. The official story had always been that Marie Kelly had left town, abandoned her husband and 8-year-old son. Adam had spent most of his life believing his mother had chosen to leave them. But his father's notes suggested something far more sinister. Had she gone to the hollow? Had it taken her too? Adam's hands shook as he gathered the materials back into the folder. Outside, the sky had darkened prematurely, heavy clouds rolling in from the east. The first fat drops of rain began to hit the shed's roof as he locked the door behind him and hurried back to the house. Inside, he spread the contents of the folder across the kitchen table and began to read more carefully. His father had been methodical, creating a timeline of events, noting patterns. Every 33 years, the hollow seemed to awaken. As one account put it, disappearances would follow. And then, silence for another generation. Long enough for memories to fade and warnings to be forgotten. 2010 had been one of those years. And now, according to his father's notes, something was stirring again years ahead of schedule. The phone rang, startling Adam from his reading. He hadn't even realized the landline was still connected. He picked up the receiver cautiously. "Hello, Adam? Adam Kelly?" The voice was familiar, though older, rougher than he remembered. "Yes, who's this?" "It's Mike. Mike Derringer. Heard you were back in town." Mike. They'd been inseparable once. Mike, Jenny, and himself, the three musketeers until that night in the hollow. After Jenny's death and Adam's hospitalization, Mike had withdrawn, refusing to talk about what happened. By the time Adam was released from the burn unit, Mike had joined the army, leaving town without saying goodbye. Mike, yeah, I'm just here to clear out my dad's place. Adam paused. How did you know I was back? A dry laugh came through the line. It's King's Hollow. Betsy at the gas station saw you drive through yesterday. News travels fast, right? Some things never changed. It's been a long time. Too long. Mike's voice dropped lower. Listen, we need to talk. About the hollow. About what really happened that night. Adam's grip tightened on the receiver. What do you mean? Not over the phone. Meet me at Dobbs Tavern? 8 o'clock. Adam hesitated. He'd planned to spend the evening continuing through his father's research, but the urgency in Mike's voice was impossible to ignore. I'll be there. After hanging up, Adam returned to the table, but his concentration was broken. Outside, the rain had increased to a steady downpour, drumming against the roof. As he gathered the papers back into the folder, his eye caught a detailed map his father had drawn of Blackwood Forest, with a hollow clearly marked at its center. Around it, in a perfect circle, Robert Kelly had noted 7 distinct locations, each marked with a small X. At the bottom of the map was a notation. Possible entry points? Ancient stone markers found at each site. Adam stared at the map for a long moment before folding it carefully and placing it in his pocket alongside his father's note. Then he grabbed his raincoat from his duffel bag and headed for the door. Dobbs Tavern wasn't far, and suddenly the house felt too quiet, too full of ghosts and questions he wasn't ready to face alone. Part 2: The Revelation. Dobbs Tavern hadn't changed much in 15 years. Same neon beer signs, same scarred wooden bar, same smell of stale beer and ancient fryer oil. Adam pushed through the door at 10 minutes to 8, shaking rain from his coat. The place was about half full, mostly men nursing beers alone or in small, quiet groups. A few heads turned as he entered, followed by the whispered recognition that ripples through small towns when a prodigal returns. Adam ignored them and took a seat at the bar, ordering a whiskey from a bartender he didn't recognize. "Make it 2, said a voice beside him, and Adam turned to find Mike Derringer sliding onto the adjacent stool. Time had been both kind and cruel to Mike. The lanky teenager had filled out into a solid man with broad shoulders and strong hands. But his eyes were older than his 32 years, shadowed with the same kind of exhaustion Adam saw in his own mirror. "You look good," Mike said, though his eyes lingered on the scarred tissue visible on Adam's left hand. "You too." Adam nodded. "Military, 10 years, 2 tours in Afghanistan. Now I'm back here working at the paper mill." Mike accepted the whiskey the bartender placed before him, raising it slightly. "To homecomings." Adam clinked glasses mechanically. "To homecomings." They drank in silence for a moment, the weight of 15 unspoken years hanging between them. "I'm sorry," Mike finally said, staring into his glass. "About what happened to Jenny. About your hand. About not being there when you got out of the hospital." Adam nodded, accepting the apology without quite forgiving. "You said we needed to talk about the hollow, about what really happened." Mike glanced around the bar, then leaned in closer. "Not here. Too many ears. Can you drive?" 20 minutes later, they were in Adam's rental car, headed toward the outskirts of town. Rain lashed against the windshield as Mike directed him to turn onto a narrow dirt road that Adam didn't remember. "My place," Mike explained as a small cabin came into view. "Dad left it to me when he passed. It's not much, but it's quiet." Inside, Mike lit a kerosene lamp, casting long shadows across the simple space. A wood stove occupied one corner, a neatly made bed another. Bookshelves lined one wall, filled with military history and, somewhat incongruously, books on geology and local folklore. Mike motioned Adam to the table, then retrieved a bottle of bourbon and 2 glasses from a cabinet. After pouring them each a generous measure, he reached under his bed and pulled out a lockbox. "I've never shown this to anyone," he said, his voice barely audible over the rain hammering on the tin roof. After what happened, I tried to forget. Joined the army, stayed away as long as I could, but it kept pulling me back. The dreams wouldn't stop. Dreams? Adam asked, his mouth suddenly dry. Mike nodded grimly as he unlocked the box. Of Jenny, of the hollow, of what's underneath. He looked up sharply. You've had them too, haven't you? That's why you never came back until now. Adam didn't answer, but his silence was confirmation enough. From the box, Mike removed a leather-bound journal and placed it on the table between them. This was my grandfather's. He gave it to me the day I enlisted, told me to read it when I was far away from King's Hollow. Said it would explain why my father drank himself to death. Why he always warned us to stay away from the hollow. Adam opened the journal carefully. The pages were filled with cramped handwriting and detailed sketches. Cross-sections of the earth beneath Blackwood Forest, diagrams of tunnels, and drawings of something that looked like a massive, segmented worm. My grandfather was a geologist, Mike explained. In the 50s, he was part of a team investigating the hollow after 3 people disappeared there. What they found? He trailed off, taking a long swallow of bourbon. Well, it's all in there, but they were ordered to keep it quiet. Something about national security, about not wanting to cause a panic. Adam flipped through the pages, his heart racing as he recognized descriptions that matched his father's notes. According to Mike's grandfather, the hollow wasn't a natural formation at all, but evidence of something vast living beneath the forest, something that periodically stirred, causing the ground to shift and collapse. And when it stirred, it fed. He called it the Dweller, Mike said softly. Some kind of ancient creature that hibernates for decades at a time. When it wakes, it needs to feed before returning to sleep. That's the cycle, every 33 years. But my father's notes, Adam said, pulling the map from his pocket. He said it was waking again years early. That's not possible if the pattern holds. Mike's face went pale as he studied the map. Shit, the markers. He found the markers. He looked up at Adam, fear naked in his eyes. My grandfather wrote about those. 7 stone formations in a circle around the hollow. Native Americans from this area believed they were binding stones that kept the Dweller asleep. And 3 of them were disturbed in 1988 during logging operations. That's why it woke up early then, why it took those loggers. And why? Mike hesitated. Why it might have taken your mother. Adam felt as if he'd been struck. You knew? You knew my mother didn't just leave. Mike shook his head quickly. I didn't know for sure, but my father once said something when he was drunk, about how your dad should tell you the truth about the hollow, about Marie. The pieces were suddenly clicking into horrible place. His father's note. It wasn't your fault. It never was. The timeline in the research. His mother's disappearance in 1988, when the hollow had last awakened ahead of schedule. And now it's happening again, Adam said, his voice hollow. Something's disturbed the markers. Mike nodded grimly. If your dad's notes are right, we need to check those stones. All 7 need to be intact, or the rest of the sentence hung unspoken between them. Or it will wake again. Or more people will disappear. Or what happened to Jenny will happen to others. We'll go at first light, Adam decided, draining his glass. Check the markers, see what we're dealing with. As if in response, a tremendous crack of thunder shook the cabin, making both men jump. The kerosene lamp flickered, casting grotesque, dancing shadows across the wall. Stay here tonight, Mike offered. I've got a couch. No sense driving back in this. Adam agreed, though sleep proved elusive. He lay on Mike's couch, listening to the storm rage outside and turning over the revelations of the evening in his mind. His mother hadn't abandoned them. She'd been taken, just like Jenny, and his father had known all along, had perhaps always known the truth about the hollow. In the darkest hour of the night, as rain continued to pound the roof, Adam finally drifted into an uneasy sleep, and in his dreams, he was 17 again, standing at the edge of the hollow with Jenny and Mike, feeling the ground pulse beneath his feet like a massive heartbeat. Thump, 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 thump. But in the dream, he could see what lay beneath. An enormous pale form, segmented like an earthworm but with a mouth that opened in 3 directions, lined with row upon row of teeth. And in that mouth, still alive, still screaming, were all those who had disappeared over the generations, including his mother, her arms reaching up toward him as the creature's massive jaw began to close. Adam woke with a shout, sweat-soaked and trembling, to find Mike standing over him with a cup of coffee. "Bad one?" Mike asked simply. Adam nodded, accepting the coffee with shaking hands. "Did you?" "Yeah," Mike confirmed, his face grim in the early morning light. Same dream, different details, but same thing. He couldn't bring himself to describe it further. Outside, the storm had passed, leaving behind a world washed clean and eerily still. The forest beyond Mike's cabin dripped with moisture, and a thick mist clung to the ground, obscuring the undergrowth. Perfect weather, Adam thought grimly, for hunting monsters. They set out after a quick breakfast, armed with Mike's grandfather's journal, Robert Kelly's map, a pair of shotguns, and enough supplies for a day in the woods. According to the map, the nearest marker was less than a mile from Mike's cabin, on the eastern edge of the circle surrounding the hollow. The forest was unnaturally quiet as they hiked. No birdsong or scurrying of small animals. Just the sound of water dripping from leaves and their own cautious footsteps on the soggy ground. "There," Mike said after 40 minutes of walking, pointing to a clearing ahead. The marker was a crude standing stone about 4 feet tall, partially covered in moss. Symbols were carved into its surface, spirals and lines that might have been a primitive language or simply decorative. It stood upright, apparently undisturbed. "1 down, 6 to go," Adam said, marking the location as intact on his father's map. They moved clockwise around the circle, finding the 2nd and 3rd markers similarly untouched. But as they approached the location of the 4th, both men sensed something was wrong before they even reached the clearing. The trees in the area were bent and broken, as if something massive had moved through them. Deep ruts scarred the forest floor, filling with muddy water from the previous night's rain. "Logging equipment," Mike said, crouching to examine the tracks. "Recent, too, within the last month." The marker itself lay toppled, broken cleanly in 2. The top half had been pushed aside to make way for the heavy machinery that had carved through this section of forest. "Shit," Mike muttered, running his hand along the broken stone. "Just like in '88, they're cutting again where they shouldn't be." Adam felt a cold dread settling in his stomach. According to the combined research of his father and Mike's grandfather, even 1 broken marker would be enough to disturb the dweller's sleep. And now, with the hollow already showing signs of activity, "We need to check the others," he said grimly. "And then we need to see the hollow for ourselves." The 5th marker was intact, standing sentinel in a small clearing of ferns. But the 6th, located near an old logging road, had been completely uprooted, likely by the same equipment that had damaged the 4th. "2 down," Mike said, his voice tight with tension. "That's not good. In '88, only 1 was disturbed before people started disappearing." The final marker stood at the western edge of the circle, closest to town. It was the largest of the 7, nearly 6 feet tall and covered in more elaborate carvings. As they approached, Adam felt an inexplicable heaviness in the air, a pressure against his eardrums as if they were deep underwater. Mike felt it too, pausing mid-step with a grimace. "You feel that?" Adam nodded, pushing forward despite the discomfort. The stone stood in the center of a perfect circle of bare earth where nothing grew, no grass, no weeds, not even moss on the stone itself. The carvings here were different from the others, more precise, depicting what appeared to be a stylized worm or snake devouring itself. "It's intact," Adam confirmed, though he made no move to approach the stone more closely. Something about it repelled him, made his scarred hand throb with phantom pain. "So 2 out of 7 are broken," Mike summarized, keeping his distance from the stone as well. "What does that mean for us? For the town?" Adam pulled out his father's notes, scanning them quickly. According to this, the binding weakens proportionally to the number of markers disturbed. 2 out of 7 means the dweller is about 30% awake, Mike finished, having apparently made the same calculation in his head. Enough to stir, maybe enough to sense movement above it, but not enough to fully wake and feed. Yet Adam wanted to add, but didn't. Not fully awake yet. "We need to see the hollow," he said instead. "See what we're dealing with." Mike hesitated, fear flashing briefly across his face before he mastered it. "You're right, but Adam, we should be careful. If what my grandfather wrote is true, the dweller can sense movement above it when it's stirring, and it can influence things, make the ground unstable." Adam thought of Jenny, of the earth suddenly giving way beneath her feet. Had it been random, or had the creature somehow targeted her, sensed her life force and reached up through the soil to claim it? The hollow lay at the exact center of the circle formed by the 7 markers. As they approached, the forest grew sparser, trees giving way to scrubby undergrowth, then to bare earth. The depression itself was perhaps 100 yards across, a perfectly circular bowl in the earth where nothing grew. They stopped at the edge, neither willing to step onto the bare soil of the hollow itself. From this vantage point, Adam could see what his father had photographed, a mound rising from the center of the depression, like a blister on the skin of the earth. "It's bigger," he said, pulling out the photograph to compare. "Bigger than when my father took this picture." Mike nodded grimly. "It's growing, pushing up as it stirs." He consulted his grandfather's journal. According to this, when the mound breaks open, that's when the dweller is fully awake. Adam stared at the misshapen hump of earth, trying to imagine the creature beneath the massive, segmented form from his nightmare, with its 3-part mouth full of teeth. Somewhere below, still alive if his dream was to be believed, were all those who had disappeared, including his mother and Jenny. The thought made him take an involuntary step forward, onto the bare soil of the hollow. Immediately, he felt it, a subtle vibration through the soles of his boots, a rhythmic pulsing that seemed to match the beating of his own heart. Thump thump, thump thump. "Adam!" Mike hissed, reaching out to grab his arm. "Get back!" But Adam stood transfixed, feeling the vibration grow stronger, more insistent. And then, so faintly he thought he might be imagining it, a voice. Jenny's voice, calling his name from somewhere far below. "Adam, help me. We're still here. Do you hear that?" he whispered, turning to Mike, whose face had gone chalk white. "We need to go," Mike said, his voice strained. "Now, Adam." The ground beneath Adam's feet shifted suddenly, the hard-packed soil turning soft, beginning to give way. He stumbled backward just as a small sinkhole opened where he had been standing, the earth collapsing inward with a soft sighing sound. Mike dragged him back to the edge of the hollow, both men breathing hard, adrenaline coursing through their veins. "Jesus Christ," Mike panted. "It nearly got you. It knows we're here." Adam stared at the fresh sinkhole, his mind racing. Had he really heard Jenny? Or was it the creature mimicking her voice, trying to lure him in? Either way, one thing was certain. The dweller was awakening, and 2 broken stones were enough to give it partial power. "We need to fix the markers," he said firmly. "Reset the binding before it fully wakes." Mike looked at him incredulously. "How? The stones are broken." Adam thought of his father's research, of the patterns he'd documented over generations. There must be a way. Someone must have repaired them before, or the town wouldn't still be here. He pulled out the map again. "My father marked these locations for a reason. He was tracking this, studying it. There must be something in his notes about how to restore the binding." As if in response, a deep rumble came from the center of the hollow, and both men watched in horror as the mound visibly pulsed once, growing slightly larger. "Whatever we're going to do," Mike said, backing away from the edge, "we need to do it fast. That thing is waking up, and when it does..." He didn't finish the thought. He didn't have to. They both knew what happened when the dweller fully awakened. Fed. Part 3, The Reckoning. Night was falling by the time they made it back to Adam's father's house, a premature darkness settling over King's Hollow as thick clouds gathered once more on the horizon. Another storm was brewing, as if the heavens themselves sensed what was stirring beneath the earth. Adam spread his father's research across the kitchen table while Mike built a fire in the old wood stove to ward off the deepening chill. Neither had spoken much on the trek back from the hollow, each lost in his own thoughts, processing what they had witnessed. "There has to be something here," Adam muttered, scanning through the meticulous notes. "My father wouldn't have just documented the problem without looking for a solution." His eye caught a section he'd overlooked before, a series of interviews with Sarah Little Creek, identified as last descendant of original Abenaki inhabitants. The old woman had spoken to Robert Kelly just months before his death, sharing what she called the old stories about the hollow and what lay beneath. "The stones were placed by my ancestors," she had told him, "7 guardians to bind the hunger that sleeps. When the white settlers came, they cut down the sacred trees that helped power the binding. That's when the cycle began, the partial wakings, the feedings." Adam read aloud to Mike. "She claims the original binding used natural elements, stone marked with symbols of containment, positioned at power points around the hollow, reinforced by 7 specific trees that no longer exist." Mike looked up from stoking the fire. "Trees? What trees?" Adam continued reading. "According to Little Creek, each stone was paired with a guardian tree, a white ash grown from seeds soaked in a mixture of ingredients including, apparently, human blood freely given." He grimaced at that detail. "The trees were cut down during early settlement, which weakened the binding, but the stones retained enough power to keep the creature mostly dormant except for brief periods every 33 years. So we need to restore the trees to strengthen the binding?" Mike asked skeptically. "Trees take decades to grow." Adam continued scanning the notes. "Wait, there's more. Little Creek told my father that in an emergency, the binding could be temporarily reinforced by placing certain objects at each marker stone." His voice grew more excited as he read on. 7 objects of personal significance, freely surrendered by 7 individuals. The sacrifice strengthens the stone's power for another cycle. Sacrifice. Mike's voice cracked slightly on the word. "Not like that," Adam clarified. "Just objects of personal value, given up willingly. Symbols of connection to the living world above that help. I don't know, remind the stones of their purpose." He continued reading. "Little Creek's grandmother was one of 7 who reinforced the binding in 1955, after a logging operation disturbed one of the markers. They each left something precious at a stone: wedding rings, family heirlooms, items of spiritual significance. And it worked?" Mike asked, coming to look over Adam's shoulder. "According to this, yes. The dweller returned to full dormancy without claiming any victims that cycle." Adam flipped through more pages. "There are similar accounts from 1889 and 1922, though with fewer details." Mike paced the small kitchen, processing this information. "So we need 7 people, 7 personal items of significance, and we need to place them at the stones before that thing in the hollow fully wakes up." He ran a hand through his hair. "How long do we have?" Adam returned to his father's most recent notes, the ones written in an increasingly shaky hand as his health failed. "Based on his observations of the mound's growth rate, 3 days. Maybe 4. "Jesus," Mike muttered. "And we need to find 5 more people willing to give up something valuable based on a story about a monster under the forest? In this town, who's going to believe us?" Adam thought for a moment, then reached for his father's address book, which sat beside the telephone. "We don't need them to believe everything, just enough to help." He began flipping through pages. "My father must have had allies in this, people he confided in about his research." Sure enough, several names were marked with small asterisks. Sheriff Tom Paulson, Doc Webb, Meredith Hanson at the library, and Sarah Little Creek herself. "For names," Adam said. "If they're all still alive, plus you and me, that's 6. We need 7, Mike reminded him. Adam nodded slowly. "I know who the 7th might be." He hesitated. "Jenny's sister, Kate. She deserves to know what really happened. And she might want to help." Mike looked dubious. "Kate Patterson blames us, blames you especially, for what happened to Jenny. She's unlikely to join some crazy ritual in the woods. We have to try." Adam insisted. Everyone in this town is at risk if that thing fully wakes. The phone rang suddenly, startling them both. Adam reached for it cautiously. Hello? Adam Kelly? The voice was female, elderly, with a slight tremor. This is Sarah Little Creek. You don't know me, but your father was a friend. We need to talk. Adam's eyes widened as he looked at Mike. Ms. Little Creek, we were just discussing you, actually. How did you know I was here? A dry chuckle came through the line. The same way I know you and Mike Derringer visited the Hollow today. The same way I know the hunger is stirring. Her voice grew serious. The binding is failing faster than it should. We have less time than you think. How much time? The storm coming tonight will feed its strength. By tomorrow's sunset, the mound will rupture. The old woman's voice was matter-of-fact, devoid of the fear such a statement should carry. Come to me now. Bring what your father left you. She gave him an address on the outskirts of town and hung up before he could ask more questions. Well, Mike asked. We need to go, Adam said, gathering his father's folder. Now. They drove through darkening streets as the first drops of rain began to fall. Sarah Little Creek lived in a small blue house set back from the road, surrounded by gardens that seemed to thrive despite the October chill. Smoke rose from the chimney, and warm light glowed behind curtained windows. The door opened before they could knock, revealing a tiny woman with silver hair pulled back in a braid and eyes so dark they appeared almost black. She wore jeans and a flannel shirt like any other resident of Kings Hollow, but around her neck hung a leather pouch decorated with beadwork. You've seen it, she said without preamble, her eyes fixed on Adam's face. The hunger, it's shown itself to you in dreams. Adam nodded, unsettled by her directness. Yes, since I was a teenager. She nodded as if confirming something, then stepped back. Come in, both of you. We have work to do. The interior of the house was warm and smelled of herbs and wood smoke. The living room walls were lined with bookshelves containing an eclectic mix of modern fiction, academic texts on anthropology, and what appeared to be hand-bound journals similar to the one Mike's grandfather had kept. Your father understood, Sarah said, gesturing for them to sit at a round table near the wood stove. Better than most white folks. He listened to the old stories, made connections. She looked at Adam with something like sympathy. He blamed himself for your mother, for not warning her about the Hollow. He knew it would take her? Adam asked, his voice tight. Sarah shook her head. No one can know exactly who the hunger will choose, but he knew the risks of its stirring. She turned to Mike. And your grandfather knew too, tried to document it in his scientific way. Mike nodded. I have his journal. It mentions you, or perhaps your mother. My grandmother, Sarah corrected. She was part of the binding renewal in '55. She reached for Adam's folder. May I? Adam handed it over, watching as the elderly woman flipped through the pages with practiced ease, nodding occasionally. Your father did good work, she said finally. But there's more he didn't know. She fixed them both with a steady gaze. The binding is failing faster because someone is deliberately weakening it. Mike and Adam exchanged alarmed glances. Who would do that? Mike asked. Who even knows about this stuff besides us and maybe a handful of others? Sarah's expression was grim. Those who serve the hunger. Every generation it calls to certain people, promises them things, power, knowledge, safety from its appetite. You're saying there's some kind of cult? Adam couldn't keep the disbelief from his voice. Call it what you will, Sarah replied. But someone has been systematically damaging the markers. The logging operation was no accident. It was directed specifically to those locations. She tapped a weathered finger on the map showing the circle of stones. And they'll try to stop us from reinforcing the binding. Outside, thunder cracked directly overhead, making the windows rattle in their frames. The rain intensified, drumming on the roof. You said we have until tomorrow's sunset, Adam reminded her. We need 5 more people willing to participate in the ritual. Sarah nodded. I've already called Tom Paulson and Meredith Hansen. They've worked with me before monitoring the Hollow. They'll meet us at dawn. She poured 3 cups of tea from a pot that had been steeping on the wood stove. Dr. Webb passed last winter, I'm afraid, but his daughter Emily knows some of the truth. She'll help. That's still only 6 of us, Mike pointed out. We need 7. Sarah sipped her tea calmly. 7 there must be. The 7th will come. She looked directly at Adam. You must bring Jennifer Patterson's sister, Catherine. She bears the same blood as one the hunger has already taken. That creates a powerful connection. Adam grimaced. Kate hasn't spoken to me since Jenny's funeral. She blames me for what happened. Nevertheless, Sarah said firmly, she must be the 7th. You must convince her. They spent the next hour going over the specifics of the ritual. Each person would need to surrender something of genuine personal value at one of the marker stones. The objects would need to be buried at the base of each stone at precisely the same moment, as the sun touched the horizon. What about the broken stones? Mike asked. 2 of them are damaged. Sarah nodded. They must be upright for the ritual to work. We'll need to prop them up as best we can. By the time they left Sarah's house, it was past midnight, and the storm was at its peak. They agreed that Adam would approach Kate Patterson in the morning while Mike went with Sarah to begin preparations at the marker sites. Back at his father's house, Adam lay awake listening to the storm rage outside. Every crack of thunder seemed to shake the foundations of the house, and in the brief flashes of lightning, the shadows on his wall appeared to writhe and pulse. Thump thump, thump thump. He could feel it now, the creature's awakening resonating through the earth, through the town itself. How many others in King's Hollow felt it too? How many dismissed it as nothing more than the vibrations of the storm, unaware of what stirred beneath their feet? Morning came gray and misty, the storm having moved on but leaving behind a world that seemed somehow thinner, as if the boundary between what lay above and below had been worn down by the night's fury. Adam showered and dressed carefully, choosing his least threatening sweater, trying to look as normal and stable as possible for his confrontation with Kate. He found her address in his father's book, still in King's Hollow, just a few streets over from her childhood home. He rehearsed what he would say as he drove through the quiet Sunday morning streets. The truth seemed impossible. How could he explain a creature living beneath the forest that periodically consumed townspeople? That her sister might still be alive somewhere in its depths? That they needed her personal sacrifice to prevent others from sharing Jenny's fate? Kate's house was a neat bungalow with a small porch and flower boxes that had been recently winterized, the summer blooms replaced with hardy ornamental cabbages. Adam's courage nearly failed him as he walked up the steps, but the memory of the pulsing mound in the hollow spurred him forward. He knocked, and moments later the door opened to reveal Kate Patterson older, with strands of gray in her dark hair, but with the same heart-shaped face and determined chin as her sister. Recognition, followed by shock and then anger, flashed across her features. "Adam Kelly," she said flatly, "I heard you were back." Her hand tightened on the door as if preparing to slam it. "Kate, please," Adam said quickly. "I need 5 minutes of your time. It's important. It's about Jenny." Something in his tone must have reached her because, after a long moment, she stepped back, allowing him inside. The living room was comfortable but impersonal, like a space designed more for occasional guests than daily living. Kate remained standing, arms crossed defensively. "What about Jenny?" she asked coldly. "She's been dead for 15 years. What could possibly be important now?" Adam took a deep breath. "What if I told you she might not be dead? At least not in the way we think of death." Kate's expression hardened. "Is this some kind of sick joke?" "No joke," Adam said, pulling out his father's folder. "Please just look at these. My father spent years researching what happened in the Hollow that night. What's been happening in King's Hollow for generations." Against her better judgment, Kate's curiosity got the better of her. She accepted the folder and began to flip through it, her skepticism gradually giving way to confusion, then disbelief. "This is insane," she said finally, looking up at Adam. "A monster under the forest? Binding stones? People being kept alive somehow after being swallowed by the earth." She shook her head. You can't possibly believe this. I didn't want to, Adam admitted. But I've seen things, Kate. At the Hollow yesterday. I heard Jenny's voice. He met her gaze directly. And whatever you think of me, whatever you believe about that night, more people are going to disappear unless we act today. Even if I believed any of this, Kate said, though her voice had lost some of its certainty. Why me? Why do you need me specifically? Because you're connected to Jenny. Sarah Little Creek says that creates a powerful link that can help strengthen the binding. At the mention of Sarah's name, Kate's expression changed subtly. Sarah? The old woman who gave Jenny that necklace. A flash of recognition crossed her face. Jenny was wearing it that night. The night of the fire. Adam nodded slowly. I didn't remember that. What necklace? Kate moved to a small writing desk in the corner and pulled out a drawer. From it, she removed a small wooden box. Sarah gave it to Jenny on her 17th birthday. Said it was for protection. Her laugh was bitter. Fat lot of good it did. She opened the box to reveal a silver pendant on a leather cord. A simple circle containing a 7-pointed star. She asked me to keep it safe if anything ever happened to her. Kate continued, her voice softer now. I never understood why it was so important to her. Adam stared at the pendant, pieces clicking into place. The 7 points, they represent the 7 marker stones. This is part of it, Kate. Part of the binding. Kate looked at him for a long moment, then down at the pendant in her hand. You really believe all this, don't you? I do, Adam said simply. And we need your help. Today, before sunset. Another moment of silence stretched between them before Kate closed her hand around the pendant. Tell me what I need to do. The day passed in a blur of preparation. Sarah directed their small group with the efficiency of someone who had done this before, though Adam suspected her grandmother's stories had provided most of the instruction. They gathered at noon in the parking lot of the abandoned dairy freeze. Adam, Mike, Sarah, Sheriff Paulson, a gruff man who seemed uncomfortable with the proceedings but determined to see them through, Meredith Hanson from the library, who brought a century's worth of town records documenting the strange disappearances, Emily Webb, who carried her father's medical bag, and Kate, who had barely spoken since arriving but whose presence seemed to calm Sarah. Each of you must choose an item of personal significance, Sarah instructed, her voice carrying a formal quality now. Something that connects you to life, to your humanity. The more meaning it holds, the stronger the binding will be. One by one, they revealed what they had chosen. Sarah had a beaded bracelet made by her grandmother, who had participated in the 1955 ritual. Sheriff Paulson reluctantly produced his first badge, earned 30 years earlier. Meredith offered an antique locket containing a photo of her long-deceased husband. Emily Webb brought her father's stethoscope, the tool he had used to save countless lives in King's Hollow. Mike removed his military dog tags, turning them over in his hands before placing them in the small canvas bag Sarah provided. Adam had struggled with his choice, having few possessions that held genuine meaning. In the end, he had found it in his father's bedside table, his mother's wedding ring, which Robert Kelly had kept all these years. The last connection to Marie Kelly. All eyes turned to Kate, who slowly opened her palm to reveal Jenny's pendant. Are you sure? Adam asked quietly. That's your last piece of her. Kate nodded, her eyes bright with unshed tears. If there's even a chance she's aware, somehow, I want her to know I'm trying to help. Sarah collected their offerings in separate cloth bags, each marked with a symbol corresponding to one of the marker stones. We must place these at sundown, all at the same moment. Each of you will go to your assigned stone. She pointed to the map, noting who would go where. Adam would take the westernmost stone, the largest one with the most elaborate carvings. Kate would take the one directly opposite, on the eastern edge of the circle. What about the broken stones? Mike asked, eyeing the darkening sky with concern. The day had remained overcast, the air heavy with moisture and the peculiar electric tension that sometimes follows major storms. Tom and I will handle the northern one, Sarah said, nodding to the sheriff. Meredith and Emily will take the southern one. We'll need to prop them upright temporarily and secure them as best we can. They separated to gather the necessary tools: shovels, rope, wooden supports for the broken stones, agreeing to meet at their designated positions no later than 4:30, giving them time to prepare before the 5:13 sunset. As the others dispersed, Kate pulled Adam aside. "If this works," she said softly, "if the thing goes back to sleep, what happens to Jenny? To all the others it's taken?" Adam had been avoiding this question in his own mind. "I don't know," he admitted. "The research doesn't say." Kate nodded as if she'd expected this answer. "But you heard her voice. You think she's still alive down there, somehow?" "I heard something," Adam said carefully. "It might have been Jenny, or it might have been the creature mimicking her. Either way," he trailed off, unsure how to finish the thought. "Either way, we have to try," Kate finished for him. She looked toward the forest, her expression resolute. "For Jenny, for your mother, for everyone in this town." Adam nodded, feeling a complex mix of emotions: determination, fear, and underneath it all, a terrible guilt that he'd escaped that night when Jenny hadn't. Whatever happened today, he owed it to her to try. At 4 o'clock, they set out for their designated positions, traveling in pairs for safety. Adam walked alone, retracing his steps from the previous day to reach the western marker stone. The forest felt different now, oppressively silent, the air thick and difficult to breathe. With each step closer to the hollow, the sensation of something massive stirring beneath the earth grew stronger. Thump thump, thump thump. The rhythm was faster now, more insistent, like a heart racing toward some climactic moment. Adam reached the western stone as the light began to fade from the overcast sky. The marker stood as before, alone in its circle of bare earth, its carvings seeming to shift and change when viewed from the corner of the eye. He checked his watch: 4:45, almost 30 minutes until sunset. Following Sarah's instructions, he began to dig a small hole at the base of the stone, just deep enough to bury his mother's ring. As he worked, the air grew colder, and a mist began to rise from the damp ground, curling around his ankles like ghostly fingers. The sensation of being watched prickled at the back of his neck, but each time he turned, there was nothing but trees and fog. At 5:05, Adam heard a sound that made his blood freeze, a distant, terrible cracking, like ice breaking on a frozen lake, but deeper, more profound. It came from the direction of the hollow at the center of the marker circle. His radio, borrowed from Sheriff Paulson, crackled to life. "Something's happening at the hollow." Mike's voice came through, tight with tension. "The mound is... Jesus, it's moving." "Stay at your positions," Sarah's calm voice responded. "We must complete the ritual precisely at sunset, no matter what happens." Adam checked his watch again: 5:10. 3 minutes to go. He removed his mother's ring from its cloth bag, the small gold band catching what little light remained in the day. He thought of her face, trying to recall it clearly after so many years. Would she be down there with Jenny and all the others if the binding failed? Or was there some merciful limit to how long the dweller kept its victims alive? Another crack split the air, followed by a low, rumbling sound that Adam felt more than heard, a vibration that seemed to come from the center of the earth itself. The ground beneath his feet shuddered slightly. 5:12. 1 minute. The radio crackled again, but this time it was only static, broken by what sounded like distant screaming. Adam's hand tightened around the ring as he stared at his watch, counting down the seconds. 30 seconds. 20. 10. As the moment of sunset arrived, Adam dropped the ring into the hole and quickly covered it with earth, pressing it down firmly as Sarah had instructed. For a moment, nothing happened. Then the ground beneath him lurched violently, nearly knocking him off his feet. The marker stone began to glow faintly, the carved symbols illuminated from within by a pale blue light. The same light, Adam realized, was emerging from the soil at his feet, spreading outward in a perfect circle around the stone. The radio burst to life with multiple voices confirming the same phenomenon at their positions. 6 stones glowing, 6 circles of light spreading outward. But they needed 7. "Eastern marker, check in," Sarah's voice demanded. "Kate, are you there?" Silence. Adam's heart raced. Kate's not responding. Something's wrong. The binding won't hold with only 6, Sarah said, her voice urgent. Someone needs to get to the eastern marker now. Adam was already running, crashing through the underbrush toward the eastern edge of the circle. The forest around him seemed to warp and shift, trees bending at impossible angles as the very fabric of reality trembled with the dwellers' awakening. Another massive crack split the air, followed by a sound Adam had never heard before and hoped never to hear again. A vast, wet tearing, like flesh being ripped apart, amplified 1,000-fold. The hollow, he realized with horror. The mound was rupturing. He ran faster, ignoring the branches that whipped at his face and the roots that seemed to reach up to trip him. In the distance, he could see a faint glow, the eastern marker, its stone glowing like the others, but with no circle of light spreading from its base. As he broke into the clearing, Adam saw why. Kate lay crumpled at the base of the stone, blood seeping from a wound on her temple. Standing over her was a figure Adam recognized with shock: Doc Webb. Not Emily Webb's father, who had died last winter, but the man himself, or something wearing his appearance. The entity turned as Adam burst into the clearing, its face shifting subtly, features rearranging themselves into something that was almost, but not quite, human. "You're too late," it said in a voice that was Webb's but somehow doubled, as if another voice spoke simultaneously beneath it. "The hunger awakens. The feast begins anew." In its hand was Jenny's pendant, which it had apparently taken from Kate before she could complete the ritual. Adam didn't hesitate. He charged forward, tackling the thing that looked like Webb. They crashed to the ground, the pendant flying from its grasp to land a few feet away. The creature was inhumanly strong, its fingers digging into Adam's arms with crushing force. Its face continued to shift and flow, Webb's features melting into something ancient and terrible, a face Adam recognized from his nightmares, the face of the dweller itself. "Your mother screams for you," it hissed, its breath like the stench of opened graves. "Jennifer Patterson screams for you. Soon you will join them in the belly of the hunger." Adam fought with desperate strength, managing to break free long enough to scramble toward the pendant. His fingers closed around it just as the creature grabbed his ankle, dragging him backward. "Kate!" he shouted, seeing her stir slightly. "Kate, wake up!" Her eyes fluttered open, confusion giving way to terror as she saw the scene before her. Adam being dragged away by something that was rapidly losing its human appearance, transforming into a pallid, segmented appendage that grew directly from the earth itself. Adam threw the pendant toward her with all his strength. "Complete the ritual!" he cried as the creature pulled him relentlessly toward a widening crack in the ground. Kate lunged for the pendant, her fingers closing around it as she half crawled, half stumbled to the marker stone. The creature roared in rage, its grip on Adam tightening painfully as it sensed what was happening. With the last of his strength, Adam kicked free and rolled away just as Kate pressed the pendant into the earth at the base of the stone. The effect was immediate and overwhelming. A blinding blue light erupted from all 7 markers simultaneously, beams shooting skyward before arcing toward the center of the circle, toward the hollow. The creature shrieked, its form dissolving like smoke as the light touched it. The ground heaved and bucked beneath them like a living thing in its death throes. Trees swayed and cracked, and a terrible wailing rose from the direction of the hollow. Not a single voice but many, a chorus of the lost and taken crying out as one. Adam crawled to Kate, pulling her close as the earth continued to convulse around them. Together they watched as the 7 beams of light converged on the hollow, driving downward like spears into the heart of the earth. One final, earth-shattering roar shook the forest, and then silence fell so complete and sudden it seemed to ring in their ears like the aftermath of an explosion. Slowly, cautiously, they rose to their feet. The marker stone still glowed faintly, but the violent tremors had ceased. In the distance, they could see the others emerging from the woods, drawn toward the hollow by some shared instinct. What they found there defied explanation. Where the mound had been was now a perfectly circular pool of water, impossibly still and clear, reflecting the cloudy sky above like a mirror. Around its edges, 7 saplings had sprouted white ash trees, their young leaves unfurling in the cool evening air as if it were spring rather than late autumn. Of the dweller itself there was no sign, no monstrous form, no rupture in the earth. Only the pool, the trees, and a profound sense of absence where once there had been a malevolent presence. "It's done," Sarah said quietly, coming to stand beside them. "The binding is restored, stronger than before. The trees will grow and strengthen it further." "And what was that thing that attacked Kate?" Adam asked. "The one that looked like Doc Webb?" Sarah's expression was grim. "A servant of the hunger. There are always those who choose to serve what they fear, hoping to be spared." She looked at the others gathering around the pool. "We should check if anyone else is missing. The servants are often consumed when their master returns to sleep." Adam's gaze was fixed on the pool, its surface so still it seemed solid. "And the others? The ones it took over the years? My mother? Jenny?" Sarah placed a gentle hand on his arm. "The old stories say they are released when the hunger sleeps, their spirits finally free to move on." She paused. "But some say a part of them remains in the binding, helping to keep the dweller contained." As if in answer, a breath of wind rippled across the pool's surface, and for just a moment, Adam thought he saw faces reflected there, dozens of them, including one that might have been his mother's and another that was unmistakably Jenny's. They seemed to smile up at him before the water stilled once more. "Let's go home," Kate said softly, slipping her hand into his. "It's over." But Adam knew, as did everyone who had participated in the ritual, that it wasn't truly over. The dweller slept again, bound by their sacrifices and the power of the 7 markers. But in 33 years, or perhaps sooner if the binding weakened again, it would stir once more. And King's Hollow would need new guardians to ensure it stayed asleep, deep beneath the hollow. Epilogue. 5 years later, a small group gathered at the edge of the pool in what the townspeople now called Blackwood Sanctuary. The 7 ash trees had grown with supernatural speed, their trunks already thick, their branches forming a protective canopy over the water. Adam Kelly, now the town's unofficial historian, led a small group of teenagers around the circle of trees, pointing out the marker stones that stood sentinel among them. "This is our responsibility now," he told them solemnly. "To remember, to watch, to maintain the binding." Among the teenagers was Kate's son, born 3 years after the night of the ritual. Kate herself stood at the edge of the clearing, watching with a mixture of pride and apprehension. She and Adam had married in the spring following their confrontation with the dweller, drawn together by shared trauma and a growing affection that had surprised them both. They had named their son Robert, after Adam's father, but sometimes, when he smiled a certain way, Adam saw Jenny in him, a genetic echo of the aunt he would never meet. Mike Derringer joined them, now wearing the uniform of King's Hollow's sheriff. Following Tom Paulson's unexplained disappearance a year after the ritual, Mike had stepped up to fill the role, determined to keep the town safe from more mundane threats. "Teaching them young, I see," he commented, coming to stand beside Adam as the teenagers wandered among the trees, touching the stones with curious hands. "They need to know," Adam replied, "so it doesn't happen again." He paused, looking out over the pool, its surface reflecting the warm summer sky. "Sarah says the binding should hold for at least a full cycle this time, with the trees growing stronger each year. But eventually it'll be someone else's problem," Mike finished. "Not for us to worry about now." But Adam knew he would always worry. In his dreams, he still sometimes heard it, distant but unmistakable, coming from deep beneath the earth. Thump thump, thump thump, the heartbeat of the hunger that sleeps, waiting patiently to wake once more. ND.